Hello and welcome to Sleep Tales. I am so glad you have chosen to join me tonight. Before we begin our journey, if you enjoy these stories, please take a quiet moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support helps this space grow. I would also love to know where in the world you're listening from, so feel free to leave a gentle comment below. Now, find your most comfortable position. Let the weight of your body settle. Close your eyes and let our story begin. The town of Grey Ridge was a place made of straight lines and sharp corners. Its buildings were gray boxes of brick and concrete. Its streets were gray ribbons of cracked pavement. Even the sky seemed to hang low and heavy, a permanent ceiling of gray clouds that muffled the sun. In this town lived a young woman named Lena. She was 19 years old, and her life was a repeating line, a circle she walked every single day. Her world was a small apartment on the third floor of a tired building, a place she shared with her little brother, Leo, and their mother. Leo was 6, a small boy with big, curious eyes. Their mother was sick. A lung illness, born from the town's thick air, had made her weak. It kept her in bed most days, her breath a soft, shallow sound in the quiet rooms. Their father was a memory. He had been a soldier who went to a war years ago and never came home. His absence was a silent space in their small family, a chair that was always empty. Lena was the one who held them all together. Every morning, long before the first hint of dawn, she would leave the apartment and ride her old, heavy bicycle through the sleeping town. She delivered newspapers. The small amount of money she earned was just enough to buy food, to pay for her mother's medicine, and to keep their little home. It was a hard life, a gray life, but there was one small window of color. It came from her mother's voice. In the afternoons, she would gather Lena and Leo close and tell them stories of the one place she had ever been that was not gray. She told them about the ocean. She spoke of endless blue water, of white foam that hissed on the sand, and of air so clean and salty it felt like a new beginning. For Lena and Leo, the ocean was not a real place. It was a beautiful story, a fragile dream in a city of stone and smoke. Chapter 1. The Weight of Grey Ridge. The cold was the first thing Lena felt every morning. It was not a sudden shock. It was a slow, creeping presence that lived in the floorboards of their small apartment. It seeped through the thin glass of the single window and waited for her in the dark. Her alarm clock did not make a sound. It was broken. Instead, some deep internal clock, wound tight by responsibility, would pull her from a shallow sleep at exactly 4 o'clock. She would open her eyes to complete darkness, the only sound being the soft, whistling breath of her mother in the next room and the quiet sighs of Leo sleeping in the small bed beside hers. For a moment, she would lie perfectly still under the thin, scratchy blanket, gathering the will to move. The warmth of her own body was a precious thing, a small treasure she had to abandon. The air in the room was stale and heavy with the smells of boiled vegetables from last night's dinner and the faint medicinal scent that always clung to her mother's things. Slowly, carefully, Lena would swing her legs out of bed. Her feet touched the bare wooden floor, and the cold shot straight up into her bones. She never got used to it. She moved without a sound, a ghost in her own home. She had learned long ago how to navigate the small space in the dark, her hands brushing against the familiar shapes of the small table, the 2 wobbly chairs, the edge of the counter that held their few dishes. She dressed in silence, pulling on thick, worn trousers, and a sweater that had once been her father's. It was too big for her, but it was warm. Its wool was rough against her skin, a constant, comforting reminder. She tucked her dark hair under a tight-fitting hat and pulled on fingerless gloves. Her fingers would still get numb with cold, but it was better than nothing. Before she left, she would always perform the same small ritual. She would creep to her mother's bedside. In the faint moonlight that managed to push through the grime on the window, she could see her mother's face. It was pale and thin, but even in sleep, there was a gentleness to it. Lena would reach out and touch the small bottle of medicine on the nightstand, making sure it was full enough for the morning. Then she would look at Leo. His small face was relaxed in sleep, his mouth slightly open. He was dreaming of something other than Greyridge, she hoped. She would gently pull his thin blanket up to his chin, her touch as light as a feather. These small acts were her silent way of saying goodbye, and I love you. The front door of their apartment had a loud, groaning creak. Lena had mastered the art of opening it just enough to slip through, holding her breath until she was in the dim, dusty hallway. The building was silent. It held its breath in the deep hours of the night, waiting for the factory whistles to scream it awake. She walked down the 3 flights of stairs, her footsteps soft on the worn treads. The air grew colder with each floor she descended, until she reached the heavy front door that led to the street. Pushing it open was like stepping into another world. The air outside was sharp and bit at her cheeks. It carried the metallic taste of the town's factories, a smell that was always there, day and night. The street was empty. The rows of identical brick buildings were dark, their windows like closed eyes. A single flickering street lamp cast a weak yellow circle of light on the wet pavement. Leaning against the wall in that small pool of light was her bicycle. It was an old machine, heavy and black. The paint was chipped, and rust had started to bloom on the handlebars and chain. It had been her father's, built to be sturdy, not fast. A large wire basket was fixed to the front, and a canvas bag was strapped to a rack on the back. This was her partner in the early morning darkness. She swung her leg over the frame, the cold metal a familiar shock. The seat was cracked, and the pedals were worn smooth from years of use. With a deep breath that turned into a white cloud in the air, she pushed off. The bicycle groaned in protest. The chain clicked and skipped as it found its rhythm. Then she was moving, a solitary figure pedaling through the silent, sleeping town. The first part of her route took her through streets like her own, lined with tall, narrow apartment buildings. Here, the newspapers had to be folded just right into a tight, dense rectangle that she could slide into the mail slots on the doors. Her fingers, even in the gloves, quickly grew stiff and clumsy. She had to take a glove off sometimes to work the paper into a stubborn slot, the frozen metal of the door biting her skin. She moved with an economy of motion born from endless repetition. Coast to the curb, swing off the bike, grab a paper, fold, slide, back on the bike, and pedal to the next building. She did not think. She just did. As she rode, the town slowly revealed its different faces. She left the cramped streets of the factory workers and pedaled up a long, slow hill. The effort made her legs burn, and her breath came in ragged puffs. Here the houses were a little bigger. They had small patches of dirt in the front that some people tried to turn into gardens in the spring. The houses were still dark, but she could see the faint shapes of cars parked in the driveways. For these houses, she did not have to get off her bike. She had perfected the art of the throw. A quick fold, a smooth underhand toss, and the paper would land with a soft thud on the welcome mat. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was a quiet drumbeat in the silent morning, the only proof that she was there. She saw the town in a way no one else did. She knew which houses had dogs that would bark behind the door as she approached. She knew which porches had loose boards that would cry out when the paper landed. She knew the homes where other early risers were already awake, a single light glowing in a kitchen window, a promise of coffee and warmth that was not for her. She felt a deep, profound loneliness on these rides. The whole world was asleep, dreaming in warm beds while she was out in the cold and the dark, working. A quiet anger sometimes simmered inside her, a feeling she quickly pushed down. It was replaced by a dull sense of duty. This was for Leo. This was for her mother. The thought was a heavy stone and a steady anchor all at once. It kept her pedaling, even when her muscles screamed and the cold felt like it was turning her blood to ice. The worst part of the route was the stretch that ran alongside the factories. Here the air was thickest and a layer of fine gray dust covered everything. The massive brick buildings were alive even at this hour. Low rumbles and high-pitched whines leaked from their walls. Smoke, thick and dark, poured from the tall smokestacks, climbing into the gray sky and becoming part of it. The smell was overpowering, a mix of hot metal and burning coal that coated the back of her throat. She would pedal faster here, holding her breath as long as she could, trying to outrun the pollution that was making her mother sick. It felt like a monster, a giant sleeping beast that was slowly poisoning her town, her family. After the factories came the final part of her route, a small collection of shops in the town center. The bakery was always the first to show signs of life. A warm yellow light would spill from its windows, and the smell of baking bread would briefly chase away the factory smell. It was a smell that made her stomach ache with a hunger she had learned to ignore. She would throw the baker's paper with extra care, landing it right by the door as a small sign of respect for this pocket of warmth and life. By the time she finished her last delivery, the sky was beginning to change. The deep, inky black was softening to a bruised purple, then a pale, watery gray. The sun did not rise in Grayridge. The light just slowly seeped into the world, revealing the town in all its drab reality. Her ride home was always the hardest. Her body was tired, the adrenaline of the work was gone, and the basket on her bike was empty. It felt lighter, but she felt heavier. The weight of the coming day would settle on her shoulders. She had to get home, get Leo ready for school, make sure her mother took her medicine, and clean the apartment, all before she had to leave again for a few hours of part-time work she found, mending clothes for a tailor. She would push her bike back into its spot by the front door of her building and begin the slow climb up the 3 flights of stairs. Her legs felt like lead. The smell of her own building, usually so familiar, seemed oppressive after the relative freshness of the outside air. When she opened the door to her apartment, the day would truly begin. Leo would be stirring, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. She would move to the small kitchen area, a corner of their main room with a sink, a small stove, and a few bare cupboards. She would put a pot of water on to boil for oatmeal. It was the same breakfast every day. While the water heated, she would go to her mother. Her mother would be awake, waiting for her. Her smile was weak, but it was always there. It was the first piece of warmth Lena felt all day. Lena would help her sit up, fluffing the thin pillow behind her back. She would pour a glass of water and carefully measure out the medicine, a dark, thick liquid in a spoon. "Thank you, my love," her mother would whisper, her voice raspy. "Was it cold this morning?" "The same as always," Lena would reply, her voice flat with exhaustion. The bond between the three of them was a quiet thing, built not on grand words, but on these small, repeated actions. It was in the way Lena would carefully spoon the warm oatmeal into a bowl for Leo, blowing on it so it would not be too hot. It was in the way Leo would bring his latest drawing to their mother's bed, a crayon picture of a bright yellow sun he had never really seen, and she would praise it like it was a masterpiece. It was in the way Lena would sit by the window, a needle and thread in her hands, mending a tear in Leo's trousers, her fingers moving with a practiced skill. But beneath the quiet love, the pressure was always there. It was a constant, low hum of anxiety. The bike was making a new clicking noise. She knew the chain was old and stretched, and she had no money to replace it. If the bike broke, she could not deliver the papers. If she could not deliver the papers, they would have no money. The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. Leo's shoes were too small. His toes were pressed right against the end. She had stuffed newspaper in the holes in the soles to keep his socks from getting wet, but he would need new shoes soon. New shoes cost money they did not have. The rent was due at the end of the week. She had most of it saved, a small stack of worn bills hidden in a loose floorboard, but she was a few dollars short. The landlord was not a patient man. These worries circled in Lena's mind constantly. They made her quiet and distant. She felt a growing resentment, not towards her family, but towards their situation, towards the town, towards the world that had made life so hard. This resentment made her feel deeply guilty. How could she be angry when her mother was so sick, when Leo was so small and innocent? So she buried the anger deep inside, and it became a permanent ache in her chest, right next to the loneliness. She loved her mother and brother so fiercely it hurt, but she also felt trapped by that love, chained to this life of endless work and worry. She felt much older than 19. She felt as old as the gray buildings of the town. One afternoon, the ache was particularly bad. The landlord had knocked on the door that morning, his face impatient, reminding her about the rent. Leo had come home from school with his shoes soaked through from a puddle, and her mother had a coughing fit that left her breathless and pale for nearly an hour. After she had settled her mother and given Leo a dry pair of socks, Lena sat at the small table, staring at the brick wall outside their window. She felt like the walls were closing in. It was then that her mother called her over. Her voice was just a whisper. Lena went to the bedside and took her mother's thin, cool hand. Her mother's eyes were clear, and they looked at Lena with a deep, sad understanding. "Leo," she said, her voice gaining a little strength, "tell Leo a story for me." Lena's mind was blank. She was too tired for stories. "Tell him about the tide pools," her mother urged gently. So Lena sat on the edge of Leo's bed and began the story she had heard 100 times. She spoke of little pools of water left behind by the sea, worlds filled with tiny, colorful creatures. She described the starfish that looked like fallen stars, the little crabs that scurried sideways over the rocks, and the green seaweed that danced in the water. As she spoke, she saw it not through her own tired eyes, but through her mother's memory. Leo listened, his own eyes wide with wonder. For a few minutes, the gray apartment disappeared. They were on a sunny beach. The air was salty, and the world was full of color and life. The story was a gift from her mother, a small boat that could carry them away from Grey Ridge, if only for a little while. Later that evening, when her mother and Leo were both asleep, Lena found herself unable to rest. The worries of the day were still buzzing in her head. She walked to the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed, the only piece of furniture that had belonged to her father. She opened the lid and carefully lifted out a small, rectangular photo. It was the only one they had of her parents together. It was faded, and the corners were soft with age. It showed a young man and a young woman, their faces bright with laughter. They were standing on a beach. The sun was bright behind them, making their hair glow. The sky in the picture was a brilliant, impossible blue. Behind them, the ocean stretched out, a vast expanse of light and motion. Her mother looked so young, so healthy, so full of a joy that Lena had never seen on her face in real life. Her father had his arm around her, and he was looking at her with a love so clear it was like a physical thing. Lena traced the outline of her mother's happy face with her finger. This was the woman from the stories. This was the world she talked about. A world without smokestacks and gray dust. A world of sun and salt and endless water. Looking at the photograph, Lena felt a deep, painful longing for a life she had never known. She wondered if she would ever stand on a beach like that. She wondered if she would ever feel the sun on her face and laugh with that kind of freedom. Holding the small, precious image in her hands, in the cold, dark apartment, in the heart of the gray town, she felt a tear slide down her cheek. It was a tear for her father, whom she barely remembered, for her mother who was fading away, and for herself, the girl on the bicycle, riding in circles in the dark, dreaming of a place she had never been. The weight of Grey Ridge felt heavier than ever, an impossible burden on her young shoulders. Chapter 2. A Fading Light. The change began not as an event, but as a sound. It was a small, dry cough that started in the deepest part of the night, a tiny disruption in the apartment's quiet rhythm. At first, Lena would hear it in her sleep and simply shift, pulling the blanket tighter. But the sound grew. It became a persistent, rattling noise that would echo in the small space, shaking her mother's weak frame and waking Leo from his dreams. Soon the nights were no longer for rest. They became long, dark watches. The cough would seize her mother, and Lena would be at her side in an instant, a glass of water in her hand, her other hand rubbing gentle circles on her mother's back. She would feel the frightening fragility of her mother's bones beneath the thin nightgown. Leo would sit up in his bed, his eyes wide and scared in the gloom, watching them. The coughing fits would last for minutes that felt like hours, and when they finally subsided, her mother would be left limp and breathless against the pillows, her face slick with sweat. Lena would sit with her until her breathing evened out, until the quiet returned. But the silence that followed was different now. It was thin and fragile, stretched tight with the knowledge that the sound would come again. Sleep became a luxury they could no longer afford. Lena's pre-dawn rides became even more difficult. Her body was a heavy, aching thing that she had to force into motion. Her eyes burned with tiredness, and the cold air felt like 1,000 tiny needles against her skin. The familiar route felt longer, the hills steeper. The rhythmic thud of the newspapers landing on porches sounded loud and hollow in her tired ears. When she returned to the apartment, the day was already waiting with its demands. There was no time to rest, no moment to catch her breath. The lack of sleep made everything harder. It frayed the edges of her patience. She found herself growing quiet, the words lost somewhere in the fog of her exhaustion. Leo, sensing the change, became quieter too. He would play on the floor with his small toy car, but the happy noises he used to make were gone. He moved around the apartment carefully, as if afraid that any loud sound might trigger another one of his grandmother's coughing fits. After a week of sleepless nights, Lena knew she could not ignore it any longer. She took the small amount of money she had saved for Leo's new shoes and used it to take her mother to the town doctor. The doctor's office was a small, dim room in the basement of the town hall, and it smelled of damp paper and antiseptic. Dr. Evans was an old man with a face as gray and tired as the town itself. His eyes were kind, but they held no optimism. He listened patiently to Lena's explanation, his fingers steepled under his chin. He then examined her mother, his movements slow and methodical. He listened to her chest with a cold stethoscope for a long, long time. Lena stood by the wall, twisting a loose thread on her sweater, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The doctor finally straightened up and helped her mother sit. He looked at Lena, and in that single look, she knew. He did not have to say the words. There was no good news to be found in Grey Ridge. He spoke in a low, gentle voice, explaining that the illness in her mother's lungs had progressed. He used long, complicated words, but their meaning was simple and sharp. There was nothing to be done. He gave her a prescription for a stronger medicine, a dark syrup that would help her rest and ease the worst of the coughing. It would not cure her. It would only make the time she had left more comfortable. He placed a hand on Lena's shoulder as they were leaving. "She is a strong woman," he said. "Just keep her comfortable. That is the best thing you can do now." The walk home was a blur. The gray streets seemed to tilt and sway around Lena. The doctor's words echoed in her head, a cold, final judgment. Keep her comfortable. The phrase felt both impossible and cruel. Comfort cost money. The new medicine was more expensive. Her mother needed better food, warmer blankets, things Lena could not provide with the small income from her paper route and her mending work. A cold, fierce desperation began to take root in her heart. It was a feeling that pushed aside the exhaustion and the sadness, replacing it with a hard, sharp resolve. She would not let her mother's final days be a struggle. She would find a way. That afternoon, she walked into the town's only diner. It was a noisy place filled with the clatter of plates, the sizzle of the grill, and the loud talk of factory workers. The air was thick with the smell of grease and burnt coffee. She found the owner, a large, sweating man named Sal, and asked for a job. She told him she would do anything. Sal looked her up and down, taking in her worn clothes and the tired, determined look in her eyes. He needed a dishwasher for the evening shift. The pay was next to nothing, but it included a meal. Lena took the job without a moment of hesitation. Her life now fell into a new, brutal rhythm. She would wake at 4, deliver the papers, come home to care for Leo and her mother. In the afternoon, She would sit by the window with her mending, her fingers flying until it was time to leave for the diner. She would stand for 6 hours in a cloud of hot steam at the back of the diner, her hands plunged into greasy, scalding water. She scrubbed endless piles of plates and pots and pans, the noise of the kitchen a constant roar around her. Her back ached, her feet swelled, and her hands became red and raw. At the end of her shift, Sal would give her a plate of leftover food, which she would wrap carefully and take home for Leo's lunch the next day. She would walk home under the weak glow of the street lamps, the factory smoke tasting like poison in the air, and fall into bed, a dead weight for a few precious hours of broken sleep before it all began again. She was a ghost in her own home. She was rarely there when Leo came home from school. He would be looked after by a neighbor, a kind old woman who would give him a glass of milk and let him sit in her kitchen. When Lena did get home, late at night, Leo would already be asleep. She would stand over his bed, looking at his small, peaceful face, and a wave of guilt would wash over her. She was working to provide for him, but she was never there to be with him. He was losing his mother, and his sister was becoming a stranger. The strain began to show in the small moments they did have together. One morning, as she was rushing to get ready for her mending work, Leo accidentally spilled his cup of water. It was a small thing, but in her exhausted state, it felt like a disaster. A sharp, angry word escaped her lips before she could stop it. Leo's face crumpled, and his eyes filled with tears. He did not make a sound. He just looked at her with a hurt and confusion that was like a knife in her heart. In that moment, she saw the true cost of her desperation. She knelt and pulled him into a hug, burying her face in his hair, whispering apologies. She held him tightly, trying to pour all of her love and regret into that one embrace. She was trying to hold her family together, but she felt like she was the one who was breaking apart. Her mother seemed to understand. She watched Lena with her knowing, sad eyes. She saw the new lines of exhaustion etched around her daughter's mouth, the way her shoulders were permanently slumped forward with fatigue. She saw the redness of her hands and the haunted look in her eyes. One afternoon, when Lena came home from her mending, her mother was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than she had in weeks. There was a strange clarity in her eyes, a final burst of energy. She called Lena to her side. The room was quiet. Leo was at the neighbor's house. The late afternoon sun, filtered through the gray sky, cast a soft, gentle light into the room. "Sit with me, my love," her mother said, her voice a soft whisper. Lena sat on the edge of the bed and took her mother's hand. It felt as light and delicate as a dried leaf. "You are working too hard," her mother said. It was not a question. "I am fine," Lena lied, but the word felt hollow and false. Her mother smiled a small, sad smile. "You were never a good liar, Lena. You have your father's honest eyes." She squeezed Lena's hand. "I am so proud of you. You are so strong, but you cannot let this place, this town, swallow you and Leo. It takes everything and gives back nothing but dust." Her eyes drifted towards the window, looking at the brick wall of the building opposite them. "I do not want that for you. I want you to see the sun. I want you to feel clean air in your lungs." Tears began to well in Lena's eyes, but she fought them back. She needed to be strong for her mother. Her mother reached over to the small bedside table and picked up a small, worn tin box. The paint on it had long ago peeled away, leaving the metal a dull silver color. It was dented on one corner. She held it out to Lena. "I want you to have this," she said. Lena took the box. It was cool and smooth in her hands. It was light, and she could hear something shifting inside it. "There is not much in it," her mother continued, her voice growing weaker. "Just some silly things. But I want you to keep it, and I want you to promise me something." She looked directly into Lena's eyes, her gaze intense. "Promise me you will not give up, not on yourself and not on Leo. Promise me you will find a way out of Grey Ridge. Find a place where Leo can grow up strong and healthy. Find a place where you can be happy." "I promise," Lena whispered, the words catching in her throat. A single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. Her mother reached up and wiped it away with her thumb. Her touch was incredibly soft. "Good," she sighed, a deep, weary sound. She leaned back against the pillows, her sudden burst of energy gone. Her eyes began to close. "Tell me about the ocean one more time," Lena asked, her voice thick with unshed tears. She needed to hear the story, to hold on to the dream. Her mother's eyes fluttered open. A faint smile touched her lips. "The ocean," she breathed. "It is so big, Lena. It makes you feel so small, but in a good way. It reminds you that there is a world so much bigger than this town." Her voice was fading, becoming part of the quiet room. "The water is so clear you can see the little shells on the bottom. And the sound, it is not like any sound here. It is a deep, slow breath. The whole world breathing in and out. It washes everything away, all the dust, all the sadness. It makes everything feel clean." Her eyes closed for good this time, and her breathing settled into the shallow rhythm of sleep. Lena sat there for a long time, holding the tin box in her lap, her mother's words echoing in her mind. A promise. It was another weight on her shoulders, but this one felt different. It was not a burden. It was a guide. The days that followed were quiet. Her mother slept most of the time, lost in dreams that the strong medicine provided. Lena continued her relentless routine, but now she moved with a new purpose. The promise she had made was a secret fire inside her, a small point of warmth in the cold exhaustion. She worked not just for the rent or for the medicine, but for a future she could not yet see, a future somewhere beyond the smokestacks of Grey Ridge. She would look at Leo, watching him draw his impossible yellow suns, and the promise would solidify in her heart. She would find a way. A few days later, Lena had her longest shift yet at the diner. A cook had called in sick, and the kitchen was in chaos. She worked for 8 hours straight, her arms aching, her mind numb. When she finally left, the night was colder than usual. A sharp wind cut through the streets, carrying the smell of rain. She pulled her father's old sweater tighter around her and began the long walk home. She was so tired she could barely lift her feet. Each step was an effort. The world felt distant and unreal, as if she were walking through a dream. When she finally reached her building and climbed the 3 flights of stairs, she noticed the silence first. It was a different kind of silence than the usual quiet of the night. It was a deep, absolute stillness. There was no soft whistle of her mother's breath coming from under the door. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. She pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, except for the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Leo was asleep in his bed, a small, still shape under the blanket. In the other bed, her mother was lying on her side, facing the wall. She looked like she was sleeping. Lena walked over to the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mom?" she whispered. There was no answer. She reached out a trembling hand and touched her mother's shoulder. It was cool. She was perfectly still. Lena knew in that instant that she was not sleeping. She had simply slipped away, quietly and peacefully, while Lena was scrubbing pots in a noisy kitchen miles away. Lena stood frozen in the middle of the small, dark room. The sounds of the city outside, a distant siren, the rumble of a truck, all faded away. The only thing that existed was the profound, crushing silence in the apartment. It was a silence that was heavier than any sound. It filled the room, pressed in on her from all sides. It was the silence of a life that was finished. It was the silence of being truly and completely alone. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply stood there, the exhaustion of the last few weeks, the last few years, crashing down on her all at once. The weight of Grey Ridge had finally broken something inside her. She was 19 years old, and she was the only thing standing between her little brother and the vast, uncaring world. The promise she had made to her mother just days before now felt like an impossible, cruel joke. She looked from her mother's still form to her brother's sleeping one. And for the first time in her life, Lena felt a fear so deep and so absolute that it stole the very breath from her lungs. Chapter 3. The Promise in a Tin Box. For a long time, Lena did not move. She stood in the center of the dark room, a statue carved from shock. The world had narrowed to this single silent space. The air itself felt thick and heavy, pressing down on her. Her own breathing was loud in her ears, a rough, ragged sound that did not belong in the profound stillness. Outside, the town of Grey Ridge carried on its nightly business. A distant train wailed, its lonely call fading into the darkness. The low hum of the factories was a constant, deep note that she had never truly noticed until now, when it was the only other sound in the universe. She looked at her mother's form in the bed, then at Leo, who sighed in his sleep and turned over, his small hand clutching his blanket. They were two still points in the vast, moving world, and she was the only one awake to watch over them. The thought did not feel heroic. It felt terrifying. She was a sentry on a wall, and the enemy was the crushing, absolute truth of what had just happened. Slowly, as if her limbs belonged to someone else, she began to move. She did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her, a block of ice in her chest. Her movements were small, mechanical, and quiet. She walked to Leo's bed and gently, so gently, pulled his blanket up to his chin. His face, in the faint moonlight, was completely untroubled. He was in a safe world, a world of dreams. She did not want him to wake up. Not yet. She wanted to protect him from this new, sharp-edged reality for as long as she could. Then, she turned back to her mother. She walked to the bedside and knelt on the cold wooden floor. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on her mother's arm. The skin was cool to the touch, a final, undeniable confirmation. It was not the familiar warmth of the living, it was the deep, patient cold of things that have come to an end. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling, her hand on her mother's arm, trying to memorize the shape of her face in the gloom, trying to burn the image into her mind before it could begin to fade. She did not go back to bed. Sleep was an impossible idea, a country she could no longer visit. She took one of the wobbly wooden chairs from the table and placed it in the corner of the room, facing the two beds. She sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, and she watched. She watched the sliver of moon crawl across the dirty window pane. She watched the shadows in the room shift and lengthen. She listened to the building groan around her, the tired sounds of an old structure settling in the night. She was not thinking. Her mind was a quiet, empty space. The shock had wiped it clean of all thought, all worry, all plans. There was only this moment, this long, dark watch. The hours passed one by one, marked only by the changing quality of the darkness. The deep, heavy black of midnight slowly gave way to the thin, watery black of the pre-dawn. The factory whistles blew, a mournful sound that signaled the start of another day's labor. It was a sound she usually heard from the seat of her bicycle. The thought that she had missed her paper route barely registered. It felt like a detail from a different life, a story about someone else. The light began to seep into the room. It was not a cheerful golden light. It was the usual Grey Ridge light, a reluctant, gloomy gray that did not illuminate so much as it revealed. It crept over the floor, climbed the walls, and finally touched the faces of her sleeping brother and her still mother. The new day felt like a violation, an unwelcome intrusion on her private vigil. The world should have stopped. The sun should not have risen. But it did, and its gray light brought with it the terrible, practical question of what came next. It was this question that finally broke through the numbness. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was followed by another and another. Still she made no sound. The tears were silent, a quiet, desperate release of the pressure that had been building inside her for hours. Leo stirred. He yawned, a wide, sleepy sound, and stretched his small arms over his head. He blinked his eyes open and looked around the room. His gaze fell on Lena, sitting on the chair in the corner. He gave her a sleepy smile. "Lena," he murmured, "is it morning?" Lena wiped her face with the back of her hand and forced her stiff limbs to move. She went to his bedside and knelt, trying to shield his view of their mother's bed. "Yes, Leo, it's morning," she said. Her voice sounded strange, a rough croak. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "I'm hungry," he said, as he did every morning. Then he looked past her, towards the other bed. "Is Mama still sleeping?" he asked. The simple, innocent question was the hardest thing she had ever had to hear. The ice in her chest cracked. She took a deep, shuddering breath, knowing that she was about to break her little brother's heart. She had to choose her words so carefully. They had to be simple, and they had to be true. "Mama's not sleeping, Leo," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She took his small hands in hers. They were so warm. She was very, very tired and very sick. Her body stopped working last night. Leo's brow furrowed in confusion. He did not understand. "So she's going to the doctor?" he asked, his voice full of hope. Lena shook her head slowly. The silent tears started flowing again. "No, sweet boy, she's gone." "Gone where?" he asked, his eyes wide. "To be with Papa. Is she coming back for dinner?" The questions were like tiny, sharp stones. Each one hit her with a fresh wave of pain. She had to be strong. She had to be the grown-up now, the only one he had. "She's not coming back, Leo," she said, her voice breaking. "She's gone to a place where there's no more pain, no more coughing, but she's not coming back to our apartment." The understanding finally dawned in his eyes. It was not a sudden flash, but a slow, creeping shadow. His lower lip began to tremble. His face, which had been soft with sleep, crumpled into a mask of pure, uncomprehending grief. "No," he whispered. "No, I want Mama." He began to cry, not with loud, angry sobs, but with a quiet, heartbroken weeping that shook his entire small body. Lena pulled him into her arms, holding him as tightly as she could. He buried his face in her shoulder, and she could feel his hot tears soaking through her sweater. She held him and rocked him, murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort. "It's okay. I'm here. I've got you." But it was not okay, and he knew it. After a long time, his sobs subsided into small, hiccuping breaths. He pulled back and looked at her, his face blotchy and swollen. "Was it because I was loud?" he asked, his voice tiny. "Did I make her cough too much?" The question was a physical blow. It knocked the air from her lungs. "No," she said, her voice fierce and certain. "Oh, Leo, no, never. It was not your fault. It was not anyone's fault. It was just the sickness. It was a mean sickness, and it was too strong." She hugged him again, trying to absorb his pain, his guilt, his confusion into herself. She had to carry it for him now. That was her job. The next few hours were a strange dream. Reality came in sharp, unwelcome bursts. She knew she had to tell someone. They could not just stay in the apartment. They had no phone, so she had to go out. The thought of leaving, of walking through the normal world, was nauseating. She wrapped Leo in a blanket and took him to their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Anya. Mrs. Anya was a stout, gray-haired woman whose husband had worked and died in the same factories that had poisoned the town's air. She opened her door, a welcoming smile on her face, but the smile vanished when she saw Lena's expression and the tear tracks on her face. Lena did not have to say much. The words came out in a choked, broken whisper. "It's my mother. She's gone." Mrs. Anya's face softened with a deep, weary sadness. She had seen too much of this in Grey Ridge. She did not offer empty platitudes. She just opened her arms and pulled Lena into a strong, warm hug. Then her kindness turned practical. "Leave the boy with me," she said, her voice firm. "Go and see the doctor. I'll watch him." Lena walked through the town in a daze. The world was moving at its normal pace, but she felt like she was wading through thick, invisible water. People walked past her, their faces set in the usual grim lines of a Grey Ridge morning. Cars rumbled by. The sounds were muffled, as if she were hearing them from a great distance. She felt like a ghost, completely unseen, her private tragedy a secret she carried through the oblivious streets. Dr. Evans's office was empty, except for him. He looked up from his paperwork as she entered, and he knew at once. He did not need to ask. He listened quietly as she explained what had happened, his expression full of a gentle, professional sorrow. He took care of the necessary calls, the official paperwork that turned her mother's life into a series of names and dates on a form. He spoke in a low, calming voice, guiding her through the process. Then came the question she had been dreading. "Lena," he said gently, "we need to talk about arrangements, a funeral." A hot wave of shame washed over her. The words sounded so foreign, so impossibly expensive. She looked down at her worn shoes, at the frayed cuffs of her father's sweater. "I don't have any money," she whispered, the admission a bitter taste in her mouth. She felt like a complete failure. She could not even give her mother a proper goodbye. The doctor simply nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "Don't you worry about that right now, child," he said. "We'll figure something out. The people in this town, we look after our own." When Lena returned to the apartment building, the news had already spread. Mrs. Anya, in her quiet way, had told a few of the other women. As Lena climbed the stairs, a door opened. It was Mr. Petro from the first floor, a man who worked the night shift at the factory and who she rarely saw. He just nodded at her, his face grim, and pressed a few crumpled dollar bills into her hand. "For your mother," he said in a thick accent, and then disappeared back into his apartment. On the second floor, another door opened. A young woman with a baby on her hip, a woman Lena only knew by sight, handed her a small pot of warm soup. She did not say anything. She just gave Lena a sad, knowing look. By the time Lena reached her own door, she understood. This was what the doctor had meant. In the hours that followed, a slow, quiet procession of neighbors came to her door. They did not stay long. They did not offer words of pity that would have been impossible for her to hear. Instead, they brought things. A loaf of bread, still warm from the oven, a bar of soap, a small bag of potatoes, 2 candles, and always a few coins or a folded, worn dollar bill. It was not charity. It was a shared ritual of grief in a town that knew loss intimately. Each small offering was an acknowledgement of their shared struggle, a quiet promise that she and Leo were not completely alone. Mrs. Anya came in later that afternoon. She sat with Lena at the small kitchen table and counted the money they had collected. It was not much, but it was enough. Enough for the simplest, most basic farewell the town offered. A simple cremation. No flowers, no service, no polished wooden box. Just a quiet, dignified return to dust. Lena felt a profound, aching gratitude. These people, who had so little themselves, had given what they could to honor a woman they barely knew. In the heart of all this gray, there was a deep, resilient kindness. The next few days passed in a gray fog. The apartment was finally, truly empty. The officials had come and gone. The bed where her mother had spent her last years was now empty, the thin mattress bare. Lena had folded the blankets and put them away. The small bottle of medicine was gone from the nightstand. The air in the room felt thin, hollowed out. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the loudest thing in the room. Lena and Leo existed in this silence. Leo was quiet, his grief a heavy blanket that smothered his usual childhood energy. He would sit on the floor for hours, just pushing his toy car back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes he would ask a question. "Do you think Mama is watching us, or does it hurt to be gone?" Lena would answer him as best she could, her words simple and honest, even when the honesty hurt. And then the neighbors stopped coming. The food they had brought was eaten. The brief flurry of activity was over. And Lena was left alone with the silence, her sleeping brother, and the crushing weight of the future. It was in this profound stillness that she hit her lowest point. She sat on the chair in the dark, just as she had on that first night, but the numbness was gone. In its place was a vast, empty despair. She had kept her promise to work hard. And what had it gotten her? Her mother was gone. Her brother was heartbroken. They were alone, with no money and no hope. The promise she had made to her mother to find a way out now seemed like a cruel fantasy. There was no way out of Grey Ridge. The town was a prison, and she was a lifer. The thought of giving up settled over her, a comforting, heavy blanket. What if she just stopped? What if she just sat here until the landlord kicked them out? What if she just let the world do what it was going to do? The idea of not fighting anymore was a relief. The exhaustion in her bones, in her very soul, was so deep. She felt like she had already lived 100 years, and all of them had been tired. She had failed. She had failed her mother. She was failing Leo, and she was failing herself. The despair was a cold, dark pit, and she was letting herself fall into it. Her eyes, accustomed to the dark, drifted around the room. They passed over Leo's sleeping form, over the empty bed, and landed on the bedside table. On it sat the small, tin box. She had forgotten about it. It was the last thing her mother had given her, a final, tangible piece of their last conversation. For a long time, she just stared at it. It seemed like an object from another world, a world where promises still had meaning. With a great effort, as if lifting a tremendous weight, she pushed herself up from the chair and walked over to the table. She picked up the box. It was cool and light in her hands. She carried it back to her chair and sat down, holding it in her lap. Her fingers traced the dent on the corner, the smooth, worn metal. She remembered her mother's hand, so frail, holding it out to her. She remembered her voice, the whisper of a promise. With a trembling finger, she lifted the lid. The small, scraping sound of metal on metal was loud in the silent room. She tilted the box, and the contents slid into her open palm. The first thing she saw were the seashells. There were 3 of them. One was a perfect spiral, its inside a pearly, polished pink. Another was a flat, white disc, worn smooth by 1,000 tides. The last was a small, gray shell, a piece of Grey Ridge in this collection of wonders. She lifted the spiral shell to her ear, closing her eyes, just as her mother had described in her stories. She did not hear the ocean, of course, but she could imagine it. She could imagine the roar, the hiss of the foam, the vast, clean sound. Next, her fingers found the folded piece of paper. She carefully opened its old creases. It was not a letter. It was a child's drawing, done in faded wax crayon. It showed a bright orange starfish with 5 lopsided arms and 2 black dots for eyes. It had a cheerful, silly smile. Lena remembered drawing it. She must have been very young, sitting at the kitchen table while her mother told her a story about the sea. Her mother had kept it all these years, a small, colorful treasure hidden away in the gray world. The last item in the box was the photograph. She knew it well. Her parents, young and laughing on the beach. But seeing it now, after everything, it looked different. Before, it had been a picture of a past she could never have. Now, holding the shells and the drawing, It felt like something else. It felt like a destination. It was not just a memory, it was a map. These were not just silly things, they were clues, they were reasons. They were the physical form of the promise she had made. A wave of feeling, so powerful it made her gasp, washed through her. The grief was still there, a deep, permanent ache in her heart. But now it was joined by something else. Something fierce and hot and strong. It was resolve, the despair, the thought of giving up. It all burned away in this new fire. Her mother had not asked her to stay in Grey Ridge and fight a losing battle. She had asked her to leave. She had asked her to find the place in the photograph. The decision was instant and absolute. They were leaving Grey Ridge. She did not know how. She did not know where they would go. But she knew they could not stay here for one more day. Her mind, which had been so foggy and slow, was suddenly sharp and clear. A plan, simple and terrifying, began to form. They needed money, bus tickets, food for the journey. She stood up and walked to the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in a soft cloth, were the only two valuable things her family owned. Her father's watch, a heavy silver thing with a cracked face. It had not ticked in years. And her mother's wedding band, a plain, thin circle of gold. Her mother had given it to her on her 16th birthday, telling her to keep it safe. Taking them out of the chest felt like a desecration. They were the last pieces of her parents. Selling them felt like selling her own history. But then she looked at Leo, sleeping so vulnerably in his bed. Her history did not matter as much as his future. This was not a betrayal. It was a sacrifice. It was the only way to keep her promise. The next morning, she left Leo with Mrs. Anya one last time. She walked to the center of town, to the one pawn shop, a grimy place with a dusty window full of other people's lost dreams. She walked in, her heart pounding, the watch and the ring clutched in her hand. The man behind the counter had small, suspicious eyes. He barely glanced at her as he weighed the items, his face a mask of indifference. He offered her a ridiculously small amount of money. The old Lena, the tired, beaten-down girl, would have accepted it without a word. But this was a new Lena. This was the Lena who had made a promise. A fire she did not know she possessed flared up inside her. "It's worth more than that," she said, her voice steady and clear. The man looked up, surprised. He saw the look in her eyes, the hard, unyielding set of her jaw. They haggled, her quiet determination against his bored greed. In the end, he gave her a little more. It was still not much, but it was enough. She walked out of the shop, the small roll of bills clutched in her fist. It felt like the heaviest thing she had ever held. She did not go back to the apartment. She walked directly to the bus station. It was a loud, dirty place, smelling of diesel fumes and unwashed bodies. On the wall was a huge, faded map of the country. Her eyes scanned the coastline, the edge of the world she had only ever heard about in stories. She found a town, a small dot on the vast blue edge. Its name seemed like a sign, Port Blossom. She walked to the ticket counter. 2 tickets to Port Blossom, she said, her voice not wavering. 1 way. The man behind the glass slid 2 thin pieces of paper towards her. She paid him with the money from the pawn shop. There was just enough left over for some bread and cheese. She stood in the middle of the noisy station, holding the 2 tickets. They were flimsy and small, but they were the key. They were the way out. They were the beginning of the promise. There was no going back now. She turned and walked out of the station, back towards the apartment to get her brother. She was leaving the weight of Grey Ridge behind, one step at a time. Chapter 4. The Long Road South. Lena walked back to the apartment with the bus tickets tucked deep in her pocket. The small, thin papers felt both impossibly fragile and incredibly heavy. They were the key to everything, the price of her parents' last treasures. With every step she took on the cracked gray pavement, she felt a new sense of purpose. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in charge. The promise she had made was the thing that guided her now, a small, steady light in the darkness. When she reached her building, she took a deep breath before climbing the stairs. This would be the last time she made this climb. The thought sent a strange shiver through her, a mix of sadness and a thrilling, terrifying sense of freedom. She found Leo with Mrs. Anya, sitting at the old woman's kitchen table and drinking a glass of milk. He looked up when Lena entered, his eyes still shadowed with a grief he was too young to understand. Mrs. Anya gave Lena a searching look, and she must have seen the change in her face, the new hardness in her eyes. Lena did not have to explain much. "We have to leave, Mrs. Anya," Lena said, her voice quiet but firm. "There is nothing for us here anymore." The old woman simply nodded, her face a mask of weary understanding. She had seen many people leave Grey Ridge over the years, all of them searching for something better, a place where the air did not steal your breath and the work did not break your spirit. She placed a gnarled hand on Lena's arm. "You are doing the right thing, child," she said. "Your mother would be proud." The words were a small, precious gift, and Lena held on to them tightly. She gathered Leo, thanking Mrs. Anya with a fierce, grateful hug. Then they went back into their own apartment for the very last time. The space was cold and empty, filled with the ghosts of their small life. Every object held a memory. The wobbly chair where her mother used to sit and look out the window. The patch of floor where Leo had taken his first steps. The hook by the door where her father's coat used to hang. It was tempting to linger, to drown in the sadness of it all. But Lena knew she could not. She had to keep moving forward. She had one small canvas bag. Into it, she packed the few things they would take: a spare shirt and trousers for Leo, a spare shirt for herself, the small bar of soap a neighbor had given them, the last few pieces of bread wrapped in a clean cloth. Finally, she took the small tin box from the bedside table and placed it carefully at the very bottom of the bag, a hidden, precious foundation for their new life. Leo watched her, his expression solemn. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice small. Lena knelt in front of him and looked directly into his eyes. "We are going on an adventure," she said, trying to make her voice sound bright and exciting. "We are going to find the ocean, the place Mama always told us about." A tiny flicker of interest sparked in Leo's sad eyes. "The real ocean?" he whispered. "With starfish?" "The real ocean," Lena confirmed, her heart aching. "We have to be very brave, and the journey will be very long. Can you be brave for me?" Leo nodded, a serious, determined expression on his small face. Lena took one last look around the empty rooms. It was a sad place, a place of hardship and loss. But it had also been their home. It was the only home she had ever known. She felt a sharp, sudden pang of grief for the life she was leaving, as small and as difficult as it had been. She closed her eyes for a moment, saying a silent goodbye to the walls that had held them, to the memory of her mother's soft voice, to the girl she used to be. Then she opened her eyes, took Leo's hand, and walked out of the apartment. She did not lock the door. There was nothing left inside to protect. She did not look back. The walk to the bus station was a final journey through the familiar gray world of her childhood. She saw it all with new eyes. The smokestacks pumping their dark clouds into the sky were no longer just a part of the landscape. They were the bars of a cage she was finally escaping. The tired, stooped shoulders of the people walking to the factories were a vision of the future she was refusing to accept for herself and for Leo. She held Leo's hand tightly, her steps quick and purposeful. The bus station was just as she had left it, a chaotic place of noise and movement. The smell of diesel fumes was thick in the air. A garbled voice announced departures and arrivals over a crackling loudspeaker. People rushed past them, their faces anonymous and preoccupied. Lena found a hard wooden bench against a wall and sat down, pulling Leo close to her side. She took the tickets out of her pocket and looked at them again, just to be sure they were real. The bus was scheduled to leave in 20 minutes. It felt like an eternity. When the voice on the loudspeaker finally called their bus number, Lena's heart leaped into her throat. This was it. This was the moment of no return. She took Leo's hand, and they joined the line of people shuffling towards the open door of a large, tired-looking bus. The driver, a man with a bored, grumpy face, tore their tickets with a sharp rip and waved them on. They found 2 seats together by a large, grimy window. The seats were covered in a rough, scratchy fabric, and the air inside the bus was stale. Lena chose the seat by the window for Leo. She sat beside him, their single canvas bag at her feet. She could feel the low rumble of the engine through the floor. It was a deep, powerful vibration that seemed to match the frantic beating of her own heart. Then, with a loud hiss of its brakes, the bus began to move. It pulled away from the station, its large wheels turning slowly at first, then picking up speed. Lena watched the gray buildings of Grey Ridge slide past the window. The bakery with the warm yellow light, the corner where she used to pick up her bundles of newspapers, the tall, dark shape of the factories. She watched until the familiar streets gave way to unfamiliar ones, and then to the edge of town, where the rows of identical houses finally ended. The bus turned onto a wide, open road, and the town of Grey Ridge shrank behind them until it was just a smudge of gray smoke on the horizon. Lena leaned her head against the cool glass of the window and let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding for her entire life. The world outside the window began to change, slowly at first, then dramatically. The flat, gray landscape gave way to gentle, rolling hills, and the hills were green. It was a color so vibrant and alive that it almost hurt Lena's eyes. She had never seen so much green in one place. Trees, not the stunted, dust-covered trees of Grey Ridge, but tall, proud trees with thick green leaves, stood in vast forests that stretched as far as she could see. Fields of grass, a deep, rich green, rippled in the wind like a soft blanket thrown over the land. "What's that?" Leo asked, his small finger pressed against the window, pointing at a field of black and white cows. "Those are cows, Leo," Lena answered, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like years. "Like in the picture books?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "Just like in the picture books," she confirmed. He stared at them, completely mesmerized, until they were left behind. Then he saw a river, a wide, glittering ribbon of silver water snaking through the green land. He saw a farmhouse with a bright red roof. He saw a flock of birds that wheeled and soared in a sky that was not gray, but a pale, washed-out blue. For the first time since their mother had died, Leo seemed to forget his sadness. He was captivated by this new, colorful world. His constant questions were a welcome distraction for Lena. They kept her from thinking too much about the terrifying uncertainty of what lay ahead. She watched the world unfold with him, feeling like a child herself. This was the world her mother had spoken of, a world of life and color. For a long time, she felt a fragile sense of hope growing inside her, a tiny, delicate plant pushing its way up through the hard, barren ground of her grief. They had been on the bus for hours. The initial excitement had worn off, and a deep, weary boredom had set in. Leo had fallen asleep, his head resting heavily on her shoulder. Lena's own body ached from sitting in the same position for so long. She had given Leo the last of their bread an hour ago. Her own stomach was a tight, empty knot. A woman sitting in the seat across the aisle from them, a kind-faced woman with gray hair, had been watching them quietly for some time. She leaned over and offered Lena a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "You two look like you could use this," the woman said, her voice soft. Lena was about to refuse. Her pride, a stubborn and foolish thing, was strong. But then she looked at Leo's sleeping face, and she thought about how hungry he would be when he woke up. She accepted the sandwich with a quiet, grateful whisper. The woman just smiled, a warm, genuine smile, and then turned back to look out her own window. Lena carefully unwrapped the sandwich. It was simple, just cheese and bread, but it felt like a feast. She ate half of it, saving the other half for Leo. The simple act of kindness from a complete stranger felt like a miracle. It was a small sign that the world outside of Grey Ridge was not entirely cold and uncaring. Their first bus journey came to an end in a city larger than any place Lena could have ever imagined. The bus pulled into a massive, sprawling station that was 1,000 times louder and more chaotic than the one in Grey Ridge. The building was a confusing maze of hallways and signs. The noise was a constant, overwhelming roar of shouting voices, rolling suitcases, and the hiss and rumble of countless buses. Lena held Leo's hand in a grip of iron, terrified of losing him in the crushing crowd. Their next bus, the one that would take them south, was supposed to leave from a different part of the station. Lena looked at their tickets, her tired mind struggling to make sense of the letters and numbers. She asked a busy-looking man in a uniform for directions, but he just grunted and pointed vaguely down a long, crowded hallway before rushing off. Lena and Leo pushed their way through the sea of people. Everyone seemed to be moving with a purpose, while they were lost and adrift. They finally found the gate number printed on their tickets, but the sign above it showed a different destination. A wave of panic, cold and sickening, washed over Lena. She went to the information counter, where a long line of other confused and anxious people were waiting. After a wait that felt like an hour, it was finally her turn. She showed her tickets to the woman behind the glass. The woman glanced at them, her expression bored. "You missed it," she said, her voice flat. "That bus left 10 minutes ago." "Missed it?" Lena repeated, her own voice a hollow echo. "But how? What do we do?" The woman sighed, a long, impatient sound. "The next bus to that area isn't until tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Tomorrow morning." The words hit Lena with the force of a physical blow. They had nowhere to go. They had no money for a hotel room, no money for food. They were stranded in this enormous, indifferent city with nothing but the small bag at her feet. She just stood there speechless, the noise of the station fading to a dull roar in her ears. The woman behind the counter was already looking past her, at the next person in line. Lena stumbled away from the counter, pulling a confused Leo with her. She found an empty patch of wall far from the main crowds and slid down to the floor. She pulled her knees up to her chest and buried her face in them. The fragile hope she had been nurturing all day shattered into a million pieces. She had made a terrible mistake. She should have stayed in Greyridge. At least there, they had a roof over their heads. Here, they had nothing. They were completely and utterly alone. Leo, sensing her despair, sat down close beside her and put his small arm around her shoulders. "It's okay, Lena," he whispered, his voice trying to be brave. "We're on an adventure." His simple, trusting words were almost more than she could bear. She was his whole world, his protector, and she had already failed him. The night was the longest of her life. They found a deserted corner in a waiting area, away from the main drafts of cold air. Lena took off her father's old sweater and wrapped it around Leo, trying to create a small cocoon of warmth for him. He fell into an uneasy sleep, his body curled up on the hard, cold floor. Lena did not sleep. She could not. She sat with her back against the cold tile wall, her arm protectively around her brother, and watched. The station at night was a different world. The crowds thinned out, but it was never empty. It was a place for people with nowhere else to go. Other travelers like them tried to sleep on the hard benches. Homeless people, wrapped in thin blankets, huddled in the corners. Security guards walked their slow, rhythmic routes, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Lena felt a new kind of fear. It was not the panicked fear of being lost, but a deeper, more primal fear for their safety. She felt exposed, vulnerable. Every person who walked past them was a potential threat. Her eyes scanned the faces of the strangers, searching for any sign of danger. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours of the night, a man approached them. He was tall and thin, with eyes that darted around nervously. He did not look at her directly, but at the small canvas bag at her side. He slowed his walk as he got closer, his footsteps too quiet on the polished floor. Lena's entire body went rigid. Her heart started to pound, a hard, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She tightened her arm around Leo, who stirred in his sleep. The man took another step closer, and then another. He was just a few feet away now. He bent down slightly, as if to tie his shoe, and his hand shot out, grabbing for the strap of their bag. Something inside Lena snapped. It was not a thought. It was a pure animal instinct. All the fear, all the grief, all the desperation of the last few weeks erupted in a single, protective roar. "No!" she yelled, her voice shockingly loud in the quiet station. She threw herself over the bag, shielding it with her body, and kicked out with her foot, connecting with the man's leg. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with surprise. He had not expected the small, tired girl in the corner to fight back. Her shout had attracted the attention of a security guard who was now walking purposefully towards them. The man saw the guard, cursed under his breath, and then turned and disappeared quickly into the shadows of a long hallway. The guard came over to her. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Lena, trembling with adrenaline, could only nod. He looked at her and her sleeping brother, a flicker of pity in his eyes. "You should be careful," he said, before continuing on his patrol. Lena sat there for a long time, her body shaking, her heart feeling like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. She had been terrified, but she had also done it. She had protected them. She had protected their one small bag, which held everything they had left in the world. As the fear slowly subsided, it was replaced by a strange new feeling. It was a cold, hard sense of her own strength. She could do this. She had to. The first hint of dawn brought with it a renewed sense of purpose. The long, terrible night was over. They had survived. As the station began to fill with the morning commuters, Lena got Leo to his feet. He was stiff and groggy from sleeping on the floor. She took him to the public restroom and washed his face and hands with cold water from the sink. She straightened his clothes and smoothed his hair, small acts of normalcy in a completely abnormal situation. They went and stood by the gate for their new bus long before it was scheduled to arrive. She was not going to miss this one. When the bus finally pulled up, the driver was a man with a kind, weathered face and smiling eyes. He saw them standing there, saw their worn clothes and the tired, smudged look on their faces. As he took their tickets, he looked down at Leo. "That's a long trip for a little guy," he said, his voice a warm, friendly rumble. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, brightly colored toy car. "Maybe this will help the time pass," he said, pressing it into Leo's hand. Leo's eyes went wide. He looked at the toy, then at the driver, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across his face. "Thank you," he whispered. Lena's throat felt tight. After the fear of the night, this small, unexpected act of kindness felt monumental. "Thank you," she said to the driver, her voice thick with emotion. He just winked at her and waved them onto the bus. This time, the journey felt different. The fear and uncertainty were still there, but they were balanced by her newfound sense of strength and the memory of the driver's kindness. The world outside the window continued to change. The green hills flattened out into wide open plains. The trees became different, shorter and more rugged. The air, even through the sealed windows of the bus, began to feel different. There was a new scent to it, a clean, sharp smell that Lena had never experienced before. As the afternoon wore on, she saw something in the distance that made her heart skip a beat. It was a vast, shimmering expanse of blue, so big it seemed to touch the sky. It was the ocean. As they got closer, the clean smell grew stronger. Lena could almost taste it on her tongue. It was a salty, wild smell. The bus was now driving along a road that ran right beside the water. Leo was pressed against the window, his mouth open in a silent "oh" of pure amazement. He had never seen anything so big, so blue, so alive. The water moved constantly, little white lines of foam decorating its surface. Strange, white birds with long wings circled in the bright blue sky above. It was real. It was exactly like the stories. A profound sense of relief washed over Lena, so powerful it almost made her dizzy. She had done it. She had kept the first, most important part of her promise. The bus finally slowed, turning off the main road and into a small, bright town. The buildings were painted in cheerful colors, yellow, blue, and pink. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze. The bus came to a stop with a final soft hiss of its brakes. The kind driver opened the doors. "Port Blossom," he announced with a smile. "End of the line." Lena took Leo's hand, grabbed their single canvas bag, and stepped out of the bus. The air that hit her was warm and thick with the smell of salt and flowers. And underneath it all was a new sound, a sound she had only ever heard in her dreams. It was a deep, rhythmic rushing noise, a constant, powerful whisper. It was the sound of the sea. They were here. Chapter 5: The Sound of the Sea. The first thing that Lena noticed when she stepped off the bus was the air. It was not just air, it was a physical presence, a warm, soft blanket that wrapped around her. In Grey Ridge, the air was a thin, cold thing that you fought against. It smelled of metal and wet stone, and the ever-present smoke from the factories. You pulled it into your lungs, and it felt like breathing in dust. Here, the air was thick and alive. She took a deep breath, her first real breath of Port Blossom, and it filled her with scents she had only ever imagined. The most powerful smell was the salt. It was a clean, sharp, wild smell that seemed to scour the tiredness from the back of her throat. It was the smell of her mother's stories, the smell of the dream they had chased for so long. But there were other smells woven into it. There was the sweet, heavy perfume of flowers she did not know the names for, their bright pink and purple blossoms spilling over white fences. There was the smell of warm dust rising from the sun-baked pavement. And underneath it all, there was the deep, rhythmic rushing sound, the sound of the world breathing in and out. Just as her mother had described, Leo stood beside her, his small hand clutching hers, his head tilted back as he stared up at the sky. The sky of Port Blossom was not the low, oppressive ceiling of gray clouds she was used to. It was a vast, high, brilliant dome of blue. It was a blue so deep and so pure it felt like you could fall into it. There were no smokestacks to stain it, no haze to blur its edges. A few small, puffy white clouds drifted lazily across it like boats on a calm sea. Strange white birds, larger than any bird she had ever seen in Grey Ridge, circled high above them. They made a loud, laughing, crying sound that was both alien and beautiful. Lena squeezed Leo's hand, a silent question. He looked at her, his eyes wider than she had ever seen them, and a slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. He was not scared. He was enchanted. The bus station was not a station at all. It was just a small, open-air shelter with a bench and a sign. The bus, with its kind driver, pulled away with a friendly beep of its horn, leaving them standing alone on the side of a quiet street. The town was a shock of color. The buildings were not gray brick boxes. They were small, wooden houses painted in the colors of a child's paint set. One was the color of a lemon. The one next to it was a soft, chalky blue, like a bird's egg. Across the street, A small shop was painted a cheerful, bright pink, its windows trimmed in clean white paint. Wooden porches had comfortable-looking chairs on them, and pots overflowing with red and yellow flowers sat on the steps. Even the street was different. It was paved, but the pavement was a light sandy color, not the dark, oil-stained gray of her home. Everything was bright. The light from the sun was not the weak filtered light of Grey Ridge. It was a brilliant, golden light that made everything sharp and clear. It cast dark, distinct shadows on the ground. Lena felt as though she had spent her entire life in a dim, dusty room, and someone had just thrown open the curtains to a world she never knew existed. She had to blink, her eyes unaccustomed to so much brightness. They stood there for a long time, just looking, absorbing the new reality. Lena felt a strange, light feeling in her chest, a feeling she could not name. It was hope, but it was a hope so new and fragile she was almost afraid to acknowledge it. She looked down at Leo. He was still staring at everything, his mouth slightly open in awe. The heavy sadness that had clung to him like a shadow since their mother's death seemed to have lifted, if only for a moment. He was just a little boy seeing a beautiful new place. The sound of the waves called to them. It was a constant, beckoning presence. It was the reason they were here. Lena shifted the small canvas bag on her shoulder. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's go find it." She did not know which way to go, but she did not need a map. They just had to walk towards the sound. They started down the quiet street, their worn shoes making soft sounds on the warm pavement. The town was quiet, but it was a peaceful, living quiet, not the dead, empty quiet of Grey Ridge in the early morning. They could hear the rustle of leaves from trees with wide green fans for leaves. A small bell tinkled somewhere nearby. A lazy orange cat was stretched out on a warm patch of sunlight on a porch railing. It opened one eye to look at them as they passed, then closed it again, unconcerned. Every few steps, Leo would stop, pointing at something new. A fence made of smooth, white stones. A mailbox shaped like a fish. A spinning, colorful pinwheel in someone's front yard that whirled and danced in the gentle breeze. Lena let him take his time. This was his world now, too. She wanted him to see all of it. As they walked, the town began to reveal more of itself. They passed a small shop with a window full of things made from shells. Necklaces and bracelets and little boxes covered in tiny pearly shells. Another shop had fishing nets hanging outside and brightly colored fishing floats in the window. It smelled of salt and rope. Everything was tied to the sea. The sea was the heart of this town, the center of its life. The sound of the waves grew louder with every block they walked. It was no longer a distant whisper. It was a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate in the ground beneath their feet. Lena could feel it in her bones. The salty smell in the air was stronger now, too. It was so thick she could almost taste it. She felt a growing excitement, a knot of anticipation tightening in her stomach. They were getting closer. They were about to see the place that had lived only in her mother's stories and in her own dreams for so long. They turned a final corner. The street, which had been lined with houses and shops, suddenly opened up. And there it was. Lena stopped walking. She could not have taken another step if she had tried. Her breath caught in her throat. Leo was silent beside her, his hand gripping hers so tightly his knuckles were white. Before them, The world fell away into an endless expanse of blue. It was not just big. The word big was too small for it. It was immense. It was everything. It stretched from the edge of the sand at their feet to a horizon so far away it was just a faint, hazy line where the water met the sky. Lena had never seen so much of anything in her life. In Grey Ridge, her view had always been blocked by another building, another wall, a low ceiling of clouds. Here, there was nothing to stop her eyes from looking forever. The color was overwhelming. It was 100 different shades of blue and green all at once. Near the shore, the water was a pale, clear green, so transparent she could see the light-colored sand beneath it. Further out, it deepened to a rich, brilliant turquoise, then to a deep, dark sapphire that was almost purple in the distance. The sun, high in the sky, threw a million glittering points of light across the surface of the water. It was like a field of scattered diamonds, so bright it made her squint. And the motion. It was constant, hypnotic, and powerful. Great, gentle lines of water would rise up in the distance, build into long, rolling waves, and then curl over, their tops turning into a brilliant, frothy white as they crashed down onto the shore. The sound was not just a sound. It was a feeling. The crash was a deep, booming roar that seemed to shake the very air. It was followed by a long, soft hiss as the white foam slid up the sand, and then a gentle, pulling sigh as the water retreated, dragging tiny pebbles and shells with it. Roar, hiss, sigh. It was a rhythm, a pulse, the heartbeat of the world. Lena felt the tears she had held back for so long finally break free. They were not the silent, grieving tears she had cried in the dark apartment. These were hot, cleansing tears that streamed down her face, washing away the layers of dust and exhaustion and sorrow. She did not bother to wipe them away. She just let them fall. Her mother had been right. It washed everything away. She looked down at Leo. He was staring at the ocean, his face a perfect picture of awe. He let go of her hand and took a tentative step forward, then another, as if being pulled by an invisible string. "Wait, Leo," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She quickly took off her own heavy, worn shoes. The socks she wore were thin and had holes in the toes. She pulled them off too. Then she knelt and untied Leo's small, battered shoes, the ones with the newspaper stuffed in the soles. She pulled off his socks. The sand was warm from the sun. It was softer than anything she had ever felt. It was made of a million tiny, smooth grains that shifted and gave way under her feet. It felt like walking on warm sugar. She took Leo's hand again, and together they walked down the gentle slope of the beach towards the water's edge. The sand became damp and cool as they got closer to the waves. The hiss of the foam was loud now, a whispering invitation. A small wave, the last fizzing remnant of a larger one, slid up the sand and washed over their bare feet. The water was shockingly cold, and they both gasped. Leo laughed, a real, happy, bubbling laugh that was the most beautiful sound Lena had ever heard. He stomped his foot in the thin layer of water, sending up a tiny splash. Lena looked out at the immense living water, and she felt her mother's presence so strongly it was as if she were standing right there beside them. This was her gift to them. This was the promise fulfilled. The weight that had been sitting on Lena's chest for years, the weight of Grey Ridge, the weight of responsibility, the weight of her grief, it all seemed to lift, carried away by the endless rhythm of the waves. She let go of Leo's hand and waded a little deeper, until the cold water was up to her ankles. She stood there, facing the ocean, and closed her eyes, just feeling. She felt the sun, warm and real, on her face. She felt the cool water swirling around her feet. She felt the gentle breeze, thick with the smell of salt, moving through her hair. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free. She opened her eyes and looked down the long, curving stretch of the beach. The sand was a pale, creamy white, and it stretched for miles in both directions. In the distance, dark rocks jutted out into the water, and the waves crashed against them, sending up dramatic plumes of white spray. It was more beautiful than any of her mother's stories. It was more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. Leo was crouched at the water's edge, completely absorbed. He was poking at a piece of dark green seaweed that the last wave had left behind. He picked up a small, smooth, white stone and turned it over and over in his hand, his face a study in concentration. Lena walked back and sat down on the warm, dry sand a few feet away, just watching him. She felt a sense of peace so deep and so profound, it was almost like falling asleep. She pulled the small canvas bag into her lap and rested her hands on it. Everything they owned was in that bag. But sitting here, on this beach, she did not feel poor. She felt rich. The sun began its slow descent towards the horizon. The brilliant blue of the sky began to soften, and streaks of pale pink and soft orange appeared in the west. The light changed, becoming golden and warm. It turned the white foam of the waves a creamy yellow and made the wet sand shine like a mirror. Leo came and sat beside her, leaning his small, tired body against her side. He was holding a small collection of treasures in his cupped hands. A perfectly smooth gray stone, a small spiral shell, a piece of wood, worn by the waves into a strange, twisted shape. "Look, Lena," he whispered, as if he were in a church. "Treasures." "They're beautiful, Leo," she said, her voice just as quiet. She thought of the seashells in the tin box at the bottom of their bag, the same treasures found a generation apart. "Grandma loved to collect shells here," Lena told him, the words coming easily now. "She told me that she and Grandpa would walk along this very beach and look for them. She said she once found a starfish right over there by those rocks. She said it looked like a star that had fallen out of the sky and into the water." Leo looked over at the rocks, his eyes wide with the possibility of such magic. Lena continued to talk, her voice soft, weaving her mother's memories into this new, real place. She told him about the tide pools and how her mother used to say they were magic windows into another world. She told him how her mother loved the sound of the seagulls because they always sounded like they were laughing at a secret joke. She was not just telling him stories anymore. She was giving him back a piece of his grandmother. She was connecting him to this place, to his own past, a past he had never known. She was making this beautiful, strange beach feel like home. They sat there in silence for a long time, watching the sun sink lower and lower. The colors in the sky grew more intense, a fiery display of orange, red, and purple. The golden light faded, and the air began to grow cool. The warmth of the sand began to seep away, and as the light and the warmth disappeared, a cold, hard reality began to creep back into Lena's peaceful state of mind. The sun was setting. The day was ending, and they had nowhere to go. She looked at the town, which was now beginning to glow with warm yellow lights in its windows. From a distance, it looked cozy and inviting, but as she truly looked at it, the beauty began to feel sharp and unwelcoming. Each light in a window represented a home, a family, a safe place to sleep. It was a world they were not a part of. They were strangers here, outsiders with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few coins in a pocket. The cheerful, colorful houses no longer looked charming. They looked impossibly expensive, a world away from the life she knew. The small, friendly-looking shops were closed for the night, their doors locked. The streets, which had seemed so peaceful and quiet, now just seemed empty. The beautiful town that had looked like a dream come true a few hours ago now felt intimidating and lonely. The knot of anxiety that had dissolved in the sunlight and the sea air began to reform in her stomach, cold and tight. She had fulfilled the promise. She had brought Leo to the ocean. But she had not thought about what would happen next. She had not thought about the simple, brutal necessities of life. Where would they sleep tonight? What would they eat tomorrow? She had been so focused on the journey, on escaping Grey Ridge, that she had not allowed herself to think about the destination as a real place where they would have to survive. She felt Leo shiver beside her. The evening breeze coming off the water was cold now. She pulled him closer, wrapping her arms around him, trying to shield him with her own body. He was tired. He needed a warm bed and a proper meal, and she had no way to give him either of those things. She looked out at the ocean. The last sliver of the sun had disappeared below the horizon, leaving the water a dark, churning gray. The sound of the waves, which had been so comforting and peaceful just an hour ago, now sounded vast and powerful and indifferent. It was a beautiful, terrible force that did not care about a cold, hungry girl and her little brother sitting on its shore. The profound sense of peace was gone, replaced by the old, familiar weight of fear. They had made it to the ocean, but their journey, the real hard journey, was only just beginning. Chapter 6: A Harbor in the Pages. The darkness came quickly. There was no slow, lingering twilight like in Grey Ridge, where the city lights held the night at bay. Here, when the sun disappeared, the world was left to the moon and the stars. A sliver of a crescent moon hung in the inky black sky, and a spray of stars, more than Lena had ever seen in her life, glittered like cold, distant diamonds. Their light was beautiful, but it was not warm. It did not offer any comfort against the growing chill in the air. The sand, which had been so warm and welcoming just a few hours ago, was now cold and damp beneath them. A shiver ran through Lena, a deep, bone-numbing cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the cold of fear. She had to do something. They could not stay on the beach all night. It was not safe. It was too cold. She got to her feet, her muscles stiff from sitting for so long, and brushed the sand from her trousers. "Come on, Leo," she said, her voice sounding thin and small against the vast roar of the ocean. "We need to find a place to sleep." Leo was already half asleep, his small head nodding. He stumbled to his feet without a word, his trust in her absolute. It was a trust that felt like a heavy, impossible weight on her shoulders. She put their cold, sandy shoes back on. The damp grit was uncomfortable against her skin, but it was better than nothing. She took his hand, and they left the beach, walking away from the endless, rhythmic sound of the waves and back towards the quiet, sleeping town. The cheerful colors of the houses were muted in the darkness, their shapes reduced to dark, solid blocks against the starry sky. The warm yellow lights in the windows now looked like watchful eyes, staring at the two strangers walking through their streets. Lena felt a profound sense of not belonging. They were ghosts in this peaceful, perfect town, drifting through a world that was not meant for them. She looked for a place, any place, that might offer them shelter. The porches of the houses looked tempting, a dry space out of the wind, but she was afraid. She imagined a door swinging open, an angry voice shouting at them to leave. The thought of such a confrontation, of being seen as a beggar or a thief, was more than she could bear. They walked aimlessly for what felt like hours, their footsteps the only sound in the quiet streets. They passed a small park with a playground. The swings swayed gently in the breeze, their chains making a soft, creaking sound. There was a bench under a large tree. It was not much, but it was something. As she was leading Leo towards it, she saw a flicker of movement in the shadows near a large bush. A pair of eyes gleamed in the darkness. It was a stray dog, thin and wary. It let out a low, soft growl as they approached. Lena froze, pulling Leo behind her. The dog did not move, but its message was clear. This was its territory. Defeated, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding. The world felt full of closed doors and hostile territories. Her hope, which had soared so high on the beach, was now a small, flickering candle flame in danger of being extinguished by the cold wind of reality. She was tired, so deeply tired. Her legs ached, her stomach was a hollow, painful void, and her mind was numb with worry. Leo was stumbling beside her, his small body leaning heavily against hers. He needed to rest. She needed to be strong for him, but her own strength was fading fast. It was on a quiet side street, away from the main road that ran along the coast, that she saw it. It was a small, unassuming light, not the bright, warm yellow of a house, but a soft, dim glow coming from a shop window. Most of the other shops they had passed were dark, their windows empty and lifeless, but this one was different. As they got closer, she could see that the shop was long and narrow, its windows filled not with clothes or souvenirs, but with books. Stacks and stacks of books, their spines facing out, creating a wall of faded colors and golden letters. The sign above the door was made of old weathered wood, and carved into it were the words, "Gable's Books." It looked like a place from a different time. It was quiet and still, a small island of order and knowledge in the dark, uncertain night. The light was coming from a single small lamp on a desk at the very back of the shop. A figure was sitting at the desk, their head bent over a large open book. Lena stopped in front of the window, drawn by the light and the sight of all those books. The shop looked safe. It looked peaceful. It was not a home she would be intruding upon. It was a place of business, even if it was closed. The deep porch in front of the shop was dark and sheltered from the wind. There was a long wooden bench against the wall. It would be a dry, hidden place to rest for a few hours. It was the best option they had. She led Leo onto the porch, his small shoes making no sound on the old wooden boards. She sat him down on the bench and tucked her father's old sweater, which she had been carrying, more tightly around his shoulders. "We'll just rest here for a little while," she whispered. He was asleep before she had even finished the sentence, his head falling limp against her side. Lena sat there, her body tense and alert, ready to run if the door opened. She listened to the quiet sounds of the night, the distant muted roar of the ocean, the rustle of leaves in a nearby tree, the soft, even sound of Leo's breathing beside her. She watched the figure inside the shop. After a few minutes, the person stood up and stretched. It was an old man. He was tall and thin, with a shock of messy white hair. He wore spectacles on the end of his nose and a dark, rumpled cardigan. He walked slowly around the shop, his hands behind his back, picking up a book here, straightening a stack there. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who was completely at home, who had all the time in the world. He seemed like a kind man. His movements were gentle. Lena felt a tiny, irrational flicker of hope. Maybe he would help them. But what could she possibly ask him for? She had no money to offer. She could not just ask for a handout. Her pride, the same stubborn pride she had inherited from her father, would not allow it. The old man walked to the front of the shop and began turning off the lights one by one. Soon, the only light left was the small lamp on his desk at the back. He disappeared for a moment and then reappeared with a coat on. He was getting ready to leave. Lena's heart started to pound. This was her last chance. If he left, they would be alone in the dark again. He walked to the front door, a set of keys jingling in his hand. He put a key in the lock. Lena's mind was racing. What could she do? What could she say? The memory of the kind bus driver, the woman with the sandwich, the neighbors who had helped her in Grey Ridge, all these small acts of kindness gave her a sliver of courage. Before she could lose her nerve, before she could let the fear win, she stood up. Leo stirred, but did not wake. She took a deep breath and knocked softly on the glass of the door. The sound was small, but in the quiet street, it was loud enough. The old man froze, his hand on the key. He peered through the glass into the darkness of the porch. He could not see her clearly at first. He squinted, his brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and annoyance. He slowly, reluctantly, unlocked the door and opened it a few inches. The small bell above the door gave a tired little jingle. "We're closed," he said, his voice a low, gravelly grumble. It was not a kind voice. It was the voice of a man who did not like to be disturbed. His eyes, magnified by the thick lenses of his spectacles, were sharp and suspicious. He looked at Lena, at her worn clothes, at the smudge of dirt on her cheek, at her tired, desperate face. Then his gaze dropped to the small, sleeping form of her brother on the bench. His expression did not soften. If anything, it became even more wary. Lena's courage almost failed her. This was not the kind, gentle man she had imagined. This was a grumpy, suspicious old man who looked like he wanted nothing more than for her to disappear. But she had come this far. She could not back down now. She thought of her promise to her mother. She thought of Leo, sleeping so trustingly beside her. She forced the words out, her voice a little shaky. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir," she began. "We're not looking for a handout. I'm not asking for money." The man, who she would come to know as Mr. Gable, just stared at her, his expression unchanging. He did not invite her in. He did not ask what she wanted. He just waited. His silence was more intimidating than any angry words would have been. "I'm looking for work," Lena said, the words coming out in a rush. "I can clean. I can sweep the floors, dust the shelves, wash the windows. I can organize the books. I'm a very hard worker. I'll do anything. We just need a safe place to stay for a little while, and maybe a little food for my brother." She had said it. She had laid her desperation bare for this stranger to see. She stood there, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides, waiting for his rejection. She expected him to laugh, or to tell her to get lost, or to just shut the door in her face. He did none of those things. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. His sharp eyes seemed to be looking right through her, weighing and measuring her. He looked at her chapped red hands, the hands of a worker. He looked at the fierce, desperate pride in her eyes. He looked again at Leo, who had curled himself into a tight ball on the bench, his small face peaceful in sleep. Mr. Gable let out a long, slow sigh, a sound of deep, world-weary resignation. It was the sigh of a man who was about to do something he knew he would probably regret. "Wait here," he grumbled, and then he shut the door, leaving her alone again on the dark porch. Lena's heart sank. She thought he had gone to call the police. She was about to grab Leo and run when the door opened again. Mr. Gable was standing there, holding the door open wide this time. "Well, are you coming in, or are you going to stand out there all night catching a chill?" he said, his voice still gruff. "Bring the boy." Lena stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. She quickly, gently, scooped a sleeping Leo up into her arms. He was a heavy weight, but she barely felt it. She carried him into the bookstore. The moment she stepped inside, the most wonderful smell enveloped her. It was the smell of old paper, of leather, and of dust. It was a smell of 1,000 stories, of quiet knowledge, of time itself. It was the most comforting smell in the world. Mr. Gable locked the door behind them and then led them through the dark, narrow aisles of the bookstore. The shelves rose up on either side of them like tall, silent cliffs, filled with more books than Lena had ever seen in one place. They went to the very back of the shop, to a small, cluttered space behind the main counter. There was a narrow, steep staircase leading up. "Upstairs," he said, gesturing with his head. The staircase was dark, and the wooden treads creaked under her feet. At the top was a small landing and a single door. Mr. Gable pushed it open, revealing a small room. It was not much. It was an attic room with a sloping ceiling and a single small window that looked out onto the back alley. The room was mostly empty, used for storage. There were stacks of old, yellowed newspapers and boxes filled with dusty, forgotten books. But in one corner, there was a small, simple cot with a thin mattress and a single folded blanket. There was also a small, bare-bones bathroom with a sink and a toilet. "It's not much," Mr. Gable said from the doorway behind her. "It's where my wife used to work on her projects. Hasn't been used in years." To Lena, it was a palace. It was a room with a door that locked. It was a roof over their heads. It was safety. She gently laid Leo down on the cot. He did not even stir. She pulled the thin, musty-smelling blanket over him. "Thank you," she whispered, turning to the old man. Her voice was thick with an emotion so deep it felt like pain. "Thank you." Mr. Gable just grunted, avoiding her eyes. He seemed uncomfortable with her gratitude. "The work starts at 7 in the morning," he said. his voice all business. "There's a storeroom in the back that hasn't been sorted in 20 years. It's a filthy job. You can start there. We'll see how you do." He then pointed to a small hot plate and a kettle sitting on top of a box. "There's tea, and I'll leave some bread and cheese for the boy for the morning." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Don't think this is a handout," he said, his voice sharp. "This is a business arrangement. You work, you earn your keep. That's all. If you don't work hard, you're out. Understand?" "I understand," Lena said, nodding. "I won't let you down." He gave her one last, long, unreadable look, and then he pulled the door closed, leaving her and Leo alone in their new temporary home. The sound of his footsteps descending the creaky stairs and the final click of the lock on the shop door below were the most reassuring sounds Lena had ever heard. She stood in the middle of the small, dusty room for a long time, just listening to the silence. It was a different kind of silence from the one in their empty apartment in Grey Ridge. That had been the silence of loss. This was the silence of sanctuary. She walked over to the small window and looked out. All she could see was a brick wall and a tangle of pipes, but she knew that just a few streets away, the ocean was still there, crashing on the shore in the darkness. She had done it. She had found them a harbor. The exhaustion she had been fighting for days finally washed over her, a great, heavy wave. She did not even bother to make tea. She simply walked over to the cot, lay down on the small patch of mattress next to her sleeping brother, and pulled a corner of the thin blanket over herself. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of the old man, Mr. Gable. He was gruff and grumpy and suspicious, but he had opened his door to two strangers in the night. And for that, Lena knew, she would be eternally grateful. She fell asleep to the distant, rhythmic sound of the sea, a sound that was no longer a dream, but a real and steady promise in the quiet night. Chapter 7. Treasures from the Tide. Lena woke up not to the familiar creeping cold of a Grey Ridge morning, but to warmth. A soft, gentle warmth seeped through the thin blanket and settled deep in her bones. For a moment, she was confused, her mind still caught in the old rhythm of her former life. She expected to feel the hard, cold floorboards under her feet, to hear the shallow, rattling breath of her mother in the next room. But the air was different. It did not smell of stale cooking and medicine. It smelled of old paper and dust and a faint, distant scent of salt. She opened her eyes. The light was not the reluctant gray she had known her whole life. It was a soft, milky white light, filtering through a small, dusty window and painting a pale square on the opposite wall. The ceiling was low and sloped, and she could see the thick, dark beams of the roof just above her head. Then she remembered. The bus station, the long walk through the dark town, the bookstore, Mr. Gable. They were safe. The realization was a slow, profound wave of relief that washed over her, so powerful it was almost a physical sensation. She was not in Grey Ridge. She was in an attic room above a bookstore in a town called Port Blossom, and the ocean was just a few streets away. Leo was still fast asleep beside her on the narrow cot, his small face relaxed and peaceful. His breathing was a soft, even rhythm in the quiet room. He had not slept so soundly in weeks. Lena carefully, quietly slid off the cot. The wooden floorboards were bare and old, but they were not cold. They held a faint, residual warmth from the day before. She stood in the middle of the small room and just looked. It was a simple, forgotten space. The walls were plain wood, and the air was thick with the smell of old things. But to Lena, it was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. It was a sanctuary. It was a beginning. On a small crate next to the door, she saw what Mr. Gable had left for them. A small, hard loaf of bread, a wedge of yellow cheese wrapped in paper, and 2 apples. Next to the food was a small stack of clean, folded towels. The sight of this simple, practical kindness made her throat tighten. He was a grumpy, gruff man, but his actions spoke a different language than his words. She moved with a quiet efficiency born from years of practice. She found the small bathroom, a tiny closet of a room, and washed her face with cool, clean water from the tap. The water did not have the metallic taste of Grayridge water. It was fresh and clean. She dried her face on one of the rough but clean towels. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the sink. A tired, thin girl with dark circles under her eyes stared back at her. But for the first time in a long time, the girl in the mirror did not look completely hopeless. She looked like a survivor. Back in the main room, she used a small, sharp knife she found on the crate to cut the bread and cheese. She poured 2 glasses of water from the tap. When Leo finally stirred and sat up, blinking in the new light, his breakfast was waiting for him. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with a sleepy confusion that quickly turned to wonder. "Are we in a castle?" he whispered, looking up at the dark wooden beams. Lena smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Sort of," she said. "It's a castle made of books." They ate their breakfast in a comfortable silence, sitting on the floor with their plates on their laps. The bread was crusty and delicious. The cheese was sharp and salty. It was the best meal Lena had eaten in years. When they were finished, Lena knew it was time to work. Mr. Gable had said 7 o'clock. She looked at the light coming through the window and guessed it was close to that time. She told Leo to play quietly with the small toy car the bus driver had given him, and she went downstairs. The bookstore was silent and dark, filled with the long shadows of the morning. It felt like a sacred place, a sleeping library of dreams. She found the back storeroom Mr. Gable had mentioned. It was not a room so much as a large, deep closet, crammed from floor to ceiling with boxes, loose papers, and teetering stacks of forgotten books. A thick layer of gray, fuzzy dust covered everything. The air was heavy and smelled of mildew and decaying paper. It looked like a hopeless, impossible task. The old Lena, the tired girl from Grayridge, would have been overwhelmed. But this Lena felt a strange sense of determination. This mess, this chaos, was a problem she could solve. It was a task with a clear beginning and a clear end. She could bring order to this small, forgotten corner of the world. And that felt like a powerful thing. She started simply. She found an old broom and began to sweep a small, clear space on the floor. The dust rose up in thick, choking clouds, dancing in the single beam of light that came from a high, grimy window. She tied a cloth over her nose and mouth and kept working. She began with the easiest stack, a pile of old, water-damaged novels whose covers had warped and faded. She knew they could not be sold. She carefully stacked them in an empty corner, creating a discard pile. Then she moved to a box. It was heavy, filled with old textbooks with faded, serious titles. She wiped the dust from each one with a soft cloth, her movements slow and methodical. She began to create new stacks on the floor of her cleared space, organized by size and subject. It was hard, dirty work. Her back began to ache, and her hands were soon black with grime. But she did not mind. The physical labor was a relief. It quieted the worried voices in her head. There was only the task, the simple, satisfying work of sorting and cleaning. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear Mr. Gable arrive. The first she knew of his presence was the sound of the small bell over the shop door jingling, followed by the heavy thud of his footsteps. A few minutes later, he appeared in the doorway of the storeroom. He stood there for a moment, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. He watched her as she worked, her movements efficient and focused. She had not just been moving things around. She had created a system. There was a pile for books that needed repair, a pile for books to be priced, and the pile for discards. She had already made a noticeable dent in the chaos. Lena stopped when she saw him, feeling a little nervous, like a student under the watchful eye of a strict teacher. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice muffled by the cloth over her face. He just grunted in response. "There's a bucket and rags in the closet by the back door," he said. "The shelves need to be washed down before anything goes back on them." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone again. It was not praise, but it was not criticism either. It was an instruction, an acknowledgement that she was doing the job he had given her. For Lena, that was enough. That first day set the rhythm for the weeks that followed. Their life fell into a simple, predictable pattern, a quiet routine that was as comforting as a warm blanket. Lena would wake early and work in the storeroom for hours, slowly, steadily, transforming the chaos into order. Mr. Gable would arrive around 8, and they would work in a shared, comfortable silence. He would sit at his desk at the back of the store, repairing old books with a surgeon's delicate skill, his long, thin fingers working with glue and thread and fine paper. Lena would continue her work in the back, the soft scrape and rustle of her movements, a quiet accompaniment to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Leo, in the beginning, would stay upstairs in the attic room, but he soon grew bold enough to come down the creaky stairs and explore the magical world of the bookstore. He would sit quietly on the floor in a sunny patch of light, carefully turning the pages of large picture books about dinosaurs and deep-sea creatures. Mr. Gable never told him to be quiet or to put the books away. He would simply watch the boy from over the top of his spectacles, a flicker of something soft and unreadable in his sharp eyes. He even started leaving a specific picture book on a low shelf for Leo each morning, a silent, gruff gift. Mr. Gable was a man of few words, but he was a good teacher. He taught Lena not with lectures, but with simple, direct actions. One afternoon, he called her over to his desk. He was holding a very old book with a cracked leather spine. Without a word, he showed her how to gently apply a special kind of glue with a fine brush, how to press the leather back into place, and how to wrap it tightly with waxed paper and string until it was dry. The next day, he placed a small stack of books with similar injuries on her work table. There was no instruction, just an expectation. Lena spent the entire afternoon carefully, patiently, repairing the spines, her fingers slowly learning the delicate craft. When she was finished, Mr. Gable inspected her work with a critical eye, grunted once, a sound that she was beginning to learn meant approval, and then put the books on a shelf to be sold. She felt a quiet, deep pride in that small accomplishment. She was not just cleaning, she was learning. She was helping to save these old, forgotten stories. Their life was small and self-contained. They lived and worked within the quiet, paper-scented walls of Gable's books. Lena was paid a small wage each week, a handful of bills that Mr. Gable would leave in an envelope on her work table. It was not much, but it was more money than she had ever had in her life. It was enough to buy them simple food from the small grocery store down the street. It was enough to buy Leo a new pair of sturdy shoes without any holes in them. The first time she walked into the shoe store and paid for them with her own money, she felt a surge of independence so powerful it almost made her dizzy. She was providing for her brother. She was standing on her own 2 feet. As the weeks turned into a month, Leo began to change. The quiet, solemn little boy from Grey Ridge was slowly disappearing, replaced by a child who was curious and bright, and for the first time, truly happy. The clean air and the good, simple food were bringing color back to his cheeks. But the biggest change came from the ocean. Every evening after the bookstore closed and Mr. Gable had gone home, Lena would take Leo to the beach. This became their sacred ritual, the most important part of their day. It was their time to connect with each other and to connect with the memory of their mother. They would walk along the edge of the water as the tide went out, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery colors. The beach was different every single day. The tide would wash away their footprints from the day before, leaving a fresh, clean slate. It would bring in new treasures, leaving them scattered on the wet sand like jewels. At first, Leo was shy and hesitant. He would stay close to Lena, holding her hand. But the lure of the beach was too strong. He started to venture out on his own, his eyes scanning the sand for interesting things. He would let out a shout of pure joy when he found a particularly beautiful shell or a piece of sea glass worn smooth and frosty by the waves. He would run back to Lena, his hands full of his finds, his face glowing with excitement. "Look, Lena, this one is the color of the sky," he would say, holding up a piece of pale blue glass. Or, "This shell has stripes like a tiger." Lena would share in his excitement, examining each treasure with the seriousness it deserved. These walks were a healing balm for both of them. For Leo, it was a time of pure, simple discovery. For Lena, it was a time of quiet reflection. As they walked, she would tell him her mother's stories, her voice soft against the roar of the waves. The stories were no longer just sad reminders of what they had lost. They were a living part of this new place. They could look at the tide pools by the dark rocks and imagine the little worlds inside them, just as their mother had. They could watch the seagulls and wonder what their secret joke was. It was a way of keeping their mother with them, of making her a part of their new life. Their collection of treasures grew every day. When they returned to their small attic room, they would carefully wash the sand from their finds in the small sink. Then, they would arrange them on the wide sill of their single window. At first, it was just a random jumble of shells and stones and glass. But one evening, as Lena was placing a new piece of deep green sea glass on the sill, she found herself arranging the other pieces around it. Without thinking, she created a small, simple pattern, a circle of white pebbles with pieces of green and brown glass in the center. It was a pleasing little shape, a small spot of order and beauty. She found the act of arranging the treasures to be incredibly calming. It was like the work she did in the storeroom, but more personal. When her mind was filled with worries about money or a sudden sharp pang of grief for her mother, she would go to the windowsill. She would move the pieces around, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool surfaces of the stones and glass. She would focus on the colors, the textures, the way the different shapes fit together. It was a kind of meditation, a way of quieting the noise inside her head and creating something small and beautiful out of the things the ocean had discarded. Soon, the entire windowsill was covered in her creations. There was a long, flowing line of blue and white sea glass that looked like a wave. There was a spiral of tiny, pearly shells that looked like a galaxy. She found a flat, gray piece of slate on the beach one day and brought it back. That night, she used her prettiest pieces of glass to create a small, colorful mosaic on its surface, a picture of a flower that could never grow in Grey Ridge. She never thought of it as art. It was just something she did for herself, a private, quiet ritual that brought her a measure of peace. Leo loved her creations. He would stand at the window in the morning and look at them, sometimes reaching out a small finger to gently touch one of the shells. "It's a magic window," he told her one day, his face completely serious. And in a way, he was right. It was a window that looked out onto a brick wall, but it was filled with the magic and the beauty of the sea. One afternoon, Mr. Gable called up the stairs to her. "Lena, do you know where the invoices from the bindery are?" Lena had been sorting a box of old children's books and had seen the invoices earlier. "I think I saw them in a shoebox on the top shelf," she called back. "I'll be right down." A moment later, she heard his slow, heavy footsteps on the creaky stairs. It was the first time he had ever come up to their room. He usually just called for her from the bottom of the stairs. The door pushed open, and he stood there, a slightly flustered look on his face. "Sorry to intrude," he grumbled. "Just can't find the blasted things." Lena pointed to a dusty box on a high shelf. "They're in there," she said. As Mr. Gable reached for the box, his gaze fell upon the windowsill. He stopped, his arm still outstretched. He just stood there for a long moment, looking at the colorful arrangements of shells and glass. His face was, as usual, unreadable. He did not say anything. He just looked. Lena felt a sudden, strange flush of self-consciousness. This was her private little world, her secret ritual. She felt like he had just read a page from her diary. He finally took the box from the shelf and then walked over to the window. He leaned in, his sharp eyes examining the small mosaic she had made on the piece of slate. He reached out a long, thin finger and gently touched the edge of a piece of green glass. He did not say it was pretty. He did not say it was good. He just looked at it with a deep, focused concentration. Then he straightened up and turned to her. "Tourists are always looking for things," he said, his voice its usual gruff monotone. "Authentic things, not the plastic junk they sell in the shops on the main street." He looked back at the windowsill. People would buy these. The idea had never once occurred to Lena. These were just her private little arrangements, her way of finding peace. The thought of selling them felt strange, like selling a piece of her own mind. "I don't know how," she said honestly. "I just move them around." Mr. Gable grunted. A sound she was learning meant he was dismissing an irrelevant detail. "In the supply closet downstairs," he said, already turning to leave. "There's a box with old fishing line and a pot of glue. My wife used to use them. for her projects. He then walked out of the room and down the stairs, leaving Lena standing alone, a whirlwind of new, confusing thoughts in her mind. That night, after she put Leo to bed, she sat at the window and looked at her treasures. She thought about Mr. Gable's words. People would buy these. The idea was both terrifying and exciting. They needed the money. Her small wage was enough to live on, but it was not enough to save. It was not enough to build a real future. This could be a chance, but it also felt like a betrayal of her quiet ritual. The next evening, on their walk, she found a particularly beautiful piece of driftwood. It was pale and smooth, twisted by the water into the elegant shape of a bird's wing. She carried it back to the attic room. Later that night, driven by a curiosity she could not explain, she went downstairs to the supply closet. She found the box Mr. Gable had mentioned. Inside was a spool of thin, strong fishing line and a small, sticky pot of glue. She took them upstairs. She sat on the floor, the piece of driftwood in her lap. She chose her smallest, most delicate pieces of sea glass, the pale blues and greens and whites that looked like sea foam. Using the tip of a small stick, she began to glue them to the driftwood, creating a shimmering, colorful pattern along its elegant curves. Then, she took a few of the small, pearly shells and glued them near the top. She worked for hours, completely absorbed in the delicate, focused task. When she was finished, she held it up. It was simple, but it was also beautiful. The next day, she tried something else. She took 3 of her prettiest pieces of sea glass and, using the fishing line, carefully tied them together so they hung one below the other, a simple, elegant mobile that would catch the light. She made 2 of these. They were fragile, personal things born from her grief and her newfound peace. The thought of selling them still felt strange. The next morning, with her heart pounding in her chest, she carried her 3 small creations downstairs. Mr. Gable was at his desk, repairing a book. She walked up to him without a word and placed the piece of driftwood and the 2 sea glass hangings on the corner of his desk. He looked up from his work, his eyes glancing at the items. He picked up the driftwood, turning it over in his hands, his expression giving nothing away. He then set it down and picked up one of the hangings, holding it up to the light from the window. The pieces of glass sparkled, casting small, colored lights on the dusty floor. He did not say a word. He just stood up, walked to the main counter at the front of the shop, and cleared a small, empty space next to the old-fashioned cash register. He placed the items there. Then he took a small piece of paper, wrote a price on it with a pencil, and placed it beside them. Then he went back to his desk and his work, as if nothing had happened. Lena stood there watching the front of the store, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. For 2 days, the items sat there, untouched. People came in and out of the store, buying books. But no one even seemed to notice the small display by the counter. Lena began to feel a familiar sense of failure creeping back in. It had been a stupid idea. Her little creations were nothing special. Then, on the afternoon of the second day, a woman came into the store. She was not a local. She had the bright clothes and the curious, wandering eyes of a tourist. She was browsing the shelves when she came up to the counter to ask a question. As she was talking to Mr. Gable, her eyes fell upon the driftwood and the glass hangings. "Oh," she said, her conversation forgotten. "What are these?" She walked over and picked up one of the glass hangings, holding it up to the light, just as Mr. Gable had done. A wide, genuine smile spread across her face. "This is beautiful," she said. "It's so simple. Did you make this?" Mr. Gable just shook his head and gestured with his thumb towards the back of the store where Lena was pretending to be busy dusting a shelf, her ears burning. The woman bought both of the hangings and the piece of driftwood. As Mr. Gable was wrapping them carefully in tissue paper, she said, "You should tell whoever makes these to make more. They would sell a lot of them." When the woman had left, the little bell over the door jingling behind her, Mr. Gable walked over to the cash register. He opened the drawer with a loud clang, took out the money the woman had paid, and walked back to Lena. He held the money out to her. It was more than she earned in a whole week from her regular wages. Lena just stared at the bills in his hand. It did not feel real. She had made something with her own two hands, something that had come from the beach, from her memories of her mother, and a stranger had thought it was beautiful enough to buy. A strange, new feeling bloomed in her chest. It was not just pride. It was a sense of possibility. It was the feeling of a door opening, a door she had never even known was there. She looked from the money in Mr. Gable's hand to his face. For the very first time since she had met him, she saw the hint of a small, barely there smile at the corners of his mouth. Chapter 8. The Shoreline Gallery. The sale of those first 3 pieces was like a single stone dropped into a calm pond. The ripples spread out slowly at first, then grew wider and more powerful, changing everything. That evening on their walk, Lena looked at the beach with new eyes. It was no longer just a place of peace and memory. It was now also a place of possibility. The shells, the stones, the glass, the driftwood, they were not just treasures for her windowsill anymore. They were raw materials. They were the ingredients for a future she was only just beginning to imagine. She felt a new energy, a creative spark that she had never known she possessed. She began to experiment. She spent her small savings on better tools, a set of fine pliers and wire cutters from the town's hardware store. She bought spools of thin, silver wire. Mr. Gable, in his silent, observant way, started leaving books on her work table in the attic. They were old, forgotten books from the storeroom, books about jewelry making, about local marine life, about the art of mosaics. He never said a word, but the message was clear. He was investing in her, not with money, but with knowledge. Lena absorbed it all. She read late into the night, the single bare bulb of her attic room illuminating the pages. She learned the names of the shells she and Leo collected. She learned how to drill a tiny, perfect hole in a piece of sea glass without shattering it. She learned how to wrap a stone in a delicate cage of silver wire, turning it into a pendant for a necklace. Her small workspace on the floor of the attic grew. She organized her treasures in old wooden boxes she found in the storeroom, separating them by color, size, and shape. Her hands, which for so long had been calloused and raw from scrubbing dishes and hauling newspapers, became nimble and sure. They learned the language of wire and shell and glass. Her creations became more intricate, more beautiful. She made earrings from tiny, perfectly matched snail shells. She made bracelets by weaving small, colorful pieces of glass together with silver wire. She made sun catchers that were complex webs of driftwood and shells and glass, which threw dancing rainbows of light across the attic room when the sun hit them just right. The small, empty space on the counter next to the cash register was never empty for long. As soon as she would bring a new batch of her creations downstairs, they would sell. The tourists were the first to discover her work, drawn to its simple, authentic beauty. But soon, the locals of Port Blossom began to take notice as well. They recognized the materials, the colors of their own beaches, transformed into something new and lovely. They would come into the quiet, dusty bookstore not just for books, but to see what new things the Sea Glass Girl, as she became known, had made. Gable's books, which had been a quiet, sleepy place for decades, began to change. There was a new energy in the air. The tinkle of the bell over the door sounded more often. People who had not set foot in the shop for years came in, drawn by the word of mouth that was spreading through the small town. They would buy a piece of Lena's jewelry, and then, while they were there, they would browse the shelves and leave with a book as well. The bookstore and Lena's small, growing enterprise had become intertwined. They were helping each other to thrive. Lena and Mr. Gable became true partners, their relationship built not on words, but on a foundation of shared work and mutual respect. He was the quiet, steady anchor of the business, his decades of experience a guiding hand. She was the new creative energy, the fresh wind in the shop's old sails. A year passed, then another. The seasons of Port Blossom turned in their gentle, predictable cycle. The hot, lazy days of summer, when the town was full of tourists and the shop was always busy, gave way to the quiet, peaceful days of autumn and winter, when the locals reclaimed their town. Through it all, Lena worked. She saved every penny she could, her small hoard of money growing slowly but steadily in a locked metal box she kept hidden under her cot. The attic room, which had once felt like a palace, was now beginning to feel cramped. Her workspace had taken over half the room. Boxes of shells and supplies were stacked against the walls. It was a happy, creative clutter, but it was clutter nonetheless. Leo was no longer the small, quiet boy who had arrived in Port Blossom. He was growing tall, his legs long and lanky. He was a child of the sun and the sea. His skin was tanned, and his hair was bleached by the sun. He knew the name of every bird that flew over the beach, every creature that lived in the tide pools. The bookstore was his second home, and Mr. Gable had become a sort of gruff, silent grandfather to him. Leo would sit at the old man's desk after school, doing his homework, while Mr. Gable would patiently explain a difficult math problem or help him find a book for a report. The shadow of Grey Ridge, the memory of their mother's sickness and death, was still a part of their story, but it was no longer the only part. It was the beginning, the dark, difficult first chapter of a story that was now, finally, becoming a happy one. One evening in the early spring of their third year in Port Blossom, Lena was walking home from the grocery store. She took a different route, a back street that ran behind the main row of shops. She passed the bait and tackle shop that was next door to the bookstore. It had been closed for as long as she had lived in the town. The windows were grimy and boarded up, the paint was peeling, and a faded "For Lease" sign was tacked to the door, its letters bleached and cracked by the sun. It was a sad, neglected building, an eyesore on the otherwise cheerful street. As she walked past it, a bold, audacious idea began to form in her mind. It was a crazy idea, a dream so big it was almost laughable. But like the idea of selling her first creations, it took root and would not let go. She imagined the boarded-up windows replaced with clean, clear glass. She imagined the peeling paint scraped away and replaced with a fresh, bright coat. She imagined the dark, forgotten space inside filled with light and her beautiful creations, a proper workshop and a gallery, a place of her own. She went home, her heart pounding with the force of her new dream. That night, she could not sleep. She pulled the metal box out from under her cot and opened it. She carefully counted all the money she had saved. It was a lot. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of possessing, but she knew with a sinking feeling that it was not enough. It was not enough to lease a shop, to pay for the renovations, to buy the supplies she would need to fill it. The dream felt impossibly far away. The next morning, she went to Mr. Gable. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly. This was different from asking for a job or showing him her first creations. This was asking for help with a dream. She found him at his desk, as always, carefully mending a book. She stood before him, took a deep breath, and told him her idea. She told him everything. About the empty shop next door. About her vision for a bright, beautiful workshop and gallery. About the money she had saved, and about how it was not enough. Mr. Gable listened in his usual unnerving silence. He did not look up from his work. He just continued to stitch a new binding onto an old book, his hands steady and sure. Lena's voice faltered as she spoke, the silence stretching out between her words. When she was finished, the only sound in the shop was the quiet snip of his scissors as he cut the thread. She waited, her heart in her throat, expecting him to grunt and dismiss her idea as a foolish, childish fantasy. He set the book down on his desk and finally looked up at her. He took off his spectacles and polished them slowly with a soft cloth. He looked at her, the girl he had found on his doorstep 3 years ago, a scared, desperate child with nothing but her little brother and a fierce, stubborn pride. He looked at the confident, capable young woman she had become. "My wife," he said, his voice softer and more reflective than she had ever heard it. She was an artist too. She painted watercolors, the sea, the birds, the flowers in her garden. This bookstore, it was her dream. She always said it was a good, quiet place for stories. After she was gone, I just kept it going. It was all I had left of her. He paused, looking around the shop at the tall, silent shelves that held a lifetime of stories. But it was getting quieter and quieter every year. I was getting older. I was getting tired. I was just waiting for the story to end. He put his spectacles back on and looked directly at Lena. "And then you and the boy showed up. You brought a new story into this old place." He stood up and walked to the old, clanging cash register. He opened a locked drawer beneath it, a drawer Lena had never seen him use, and took out a small, worn, leather-bound bank book. He opened it and laid it on the counter, turning it so she could see. Lena looked at the numbers written in neat, careful columns. She gasped. It was a lot of money. It was the life savings of a man who had worked hard and lived simply for 50 years. "This shop has been good to me," Mr. Gable said, his voice back to its usual gruff tone. "It's more than I'll ever need. An old man doesn't need much." He looked at her, his eyes sharp and clear. "This is not a gift. It is an investment. In you, in the boy, and in this partnership we have built. We will use this money, and the money you have saved, and we will make your dream a reality. Together." Lena could not speak. The tears that filled her eyes were not tears of sadness or of relief. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming gratitude that was so immense it felt like it could break her heart open. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. They leased the old bait and tackle shop. A crew of local workmen were hired to tear out the old, rotten fixtures and put in new, clean walls and a polished wooden floor. A large picture window was installed at the front, flooding the once dark space with natural light. Mr. Gable oversaw the construction with the meticulous eye of a master craftsman, making sure every detail was perfect. Lena, meanwhile, worked harder than she ever had in her life. She spent her days in her attic workshop, creating a large inventory of her art to fill the new shop. She designed the layout of the gallery, planning where each display would go. She even hired her first employee, a young woman from the town named Sarah, to help her with the finishing and polishing of her pieces. The people of Port Blossom watched the transformation of the old, derelict shop with a growing sense of excitement and curiosity. The whole town seemed to be cheering for them. Friends they had made, the woman from the bakery, the man from the hardware store, even the grumpy fisherman who bought a newspaper from Mr. Gable every morning, would stop by to offer a word of encouragement or a helping hand. They were no longer the strangers, the outsiders. They were a part of the town. Finally, the day came. The renovations were complete. The shelves and display cases were in place. Lena and Sarah spent 2 full days carefully arranging her creations. The new shop was bright and beautiful, a calm, serene space that smelled of fresh paint and clean wood and the faint, salty scent of the sea that drifted in through the open door. It was everything she had dreamed of, and more. For the name of the shop, she chose something that honored both her past and her present. On the new brightly painted sign that hung above the door in elegant swirling letters were the words, "The Grey Ridge Shore." It was a reminder of where she had come from, of the gray, difficult world that had forged her strength and her determination. And it was a celebration of where she was now, this beautiful, life-giving shore that had given her a home. The grand opening was on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The entire town, it seemed, showed up. The small gallery was filled with people, their voices a happy, excited buzz. They marveled at her work, at the beauty she had created from the simple, discarded things they saw on their beach every day. Lena stood near the back of the shop, watching the scene, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She saw Leo, now a teenager, tall and confident, laughing with his school friends as he showed them a particularly intricate sun catcher. She saw Mr. Gable standing by the counter, not looking grumpy at all, but looking proud as he spoke with the mayor of the town. He looked over at her and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. It was a nod of congratulations, of partnership, of a shared victory. Later that evening, long after the last customer had gone home, Lena stood alone in her beautiful new gallery. The setting sun was streaming through the large front window, filling the space with a warm, golden light. It glinted off the silver wire of her jewelry and made the pieces of sea glass glow like embers. She was not the tired, desperate girl who had arrived in this town with nothing but a promise and a tin box of seashells. She was a successful artist, a business owner, a respected member of her community. She had built a life for herself and for her brother, a life of security and beauty and peace. She had not just fulfilled her mother's promise. She had surpassed it in ways she could never have imagined. She locked the door of her new shop and walked the few steps to the familiar entrance of Gable's Books. She went up the creaky stairs to the attic room. It was mostly empty now. Her workshop had been moved to the back of the new gallery, but she and Leo still lived there. It was their first home in this new world, and she could not imagine leaving it. She stepped out onto the small, rickety balcony that Mr. Gable had helped her build off the back of the building. From there, she could just see a sliver of the ocean, a strip of dark, glittering blue between the other buildings. The sound of the waves, the first sound she had heard in Port Blossom, was a constant, comforting presence. She looked out at the lights of the town, at the dark, peaceful sea beyond. She thought of her mother, and she knew, with a deep and certain peace, that she was proud. Lena was home.